Social psychology. What is social psychology? Social psychology is the scientific study of how people's thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are influenced by the actual, imagined, or implied presence of others. Allport 1998. By this definition, scientific refers to the empirical method of investigation. The terms thoughts, feelings, and behaviors include all of the psychological variables that are measurable in a human being. The statement that others may be imagined or implied suggests that we are prone to social influence even when no other people are present, such as when watching television or following internalized cultural norms. Social psychology is an empirical science that attempts to answer a variety of questions about human behavior by testing hypotheses, both in the laboratory and in the field. Such approach to the field focuses on the individual, and attempts to explain how the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors of individuals are influenced by other people. A relatively recent field, social psychology has nonetheless had a significant impact not only on the academic worlds of psychology, sociology, and the social sciences in general, but has also influenced public understanding and expectation of human social behavior. By studying how people behave under extreme social influences, or lack thereof, great advances have been made in understanding human nature. Human beings are essentially social beings, and thus, social interaction is vital to the health of each person. Through investigating the factors that affect social life and how social interactions affect individual psychological development and mental health, a greater understanding of how humankind as a whole can live together in harmony is emerging. Links between social psychology and sociology. Social psychology is a branch of psychology that studies cognitive, affective, and behavioral processes of individuals as influenced by their group membership and interactions, and other factors that affect social life, such as social status, role, and social class. Social psychology examines the effects of social contacts on the development of attitudes, stereotypes, discrimination, group dynamics, conformity, social cognition and influence, self-concept, persuasion, interpersonal perception and attraction, cognitive dissonance, and human relationships. A significant number of social psychologists are sociologists. Their work has a greater focus on the behavior of the group, and thus examines such phenomena as interactions and social exchanges at the micro level, and group dynamics and crowd psychology at the macro level. Sociologists are interested in the individual, but primarily within the context of social structures and processes, such as social roles, race and class, and socialization. They tend to use both qualitative and quantitative research designs. Sociologists in this area are interested in a variety of demographic, social, and cultural phenomena. Some of their major research areas are social inequality, group dynamics, social change, socialization, social identity, and symbolic interactionism. Social psychology bridges the interest of psychology with its emphasis on the individual, with sociology with its emphasis on social structures. Most social psychologists are trained within the discipline of psychology. Psychologically oriented researchers place a great deal of emphasis on the immediate social situation, and the interaction between person and situation variables. Their research tends to be highly empirical and is often centered around lab experiments. Psychologists who study social psychology are interested in such topics as attitudes, social cognition, cognitive dissonance, social influence, and interpersonal behavior. Two influential journals for the publication of research in this area are the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. Read more about sociological social psychology. History of social psychology. The discipline of social psychology began in the United States at the dawn of the 20th century. The first published study in this area was an experiment by Norman Triplett, 1898, on the phenomenon of social facilitation. During the 1930s, many Gestalt psychologists, particularly Kurt Lewin, fled to the United States from Nazi Germany. They were instrumental in developing the field as something separate from the behavioral and psychoanalytic schools that were dominant during that time, and social psychology has always maintained the legacy of their interests in perception and cognition. Attitudes and a variety of small group phenomena were the most commonly studied topics in this era. During World War II, social psychologists studied persuasion and propaganda for the U.S. military. After the war, researchers became interested in a variety of social problems, including gender issues and racial prejudice. In the 1960s, there was growing interest in a variety of new topics, such as cognitive dissonance, bystander intervention, and aggression. By the 1970s, however, social psychology in America had reached a crisis. There was heated debate over the ethics of laboratory experimentation, whether or not attitudes really predicted behavior, and how much science could be done in a cultural context. Gergen 1973. This was also the time when a radical situationist approach challenged the relevance of self and personality in psychology. During the years immediately following World War II, there was frequent collaboration between psychologists and sociologists. Sewell 1989. However, the two disciplines have become increasingly specialized and isolated from each other in recent years, with sociologists focusing on macro variables such as social structure to a much greater extent. Nevertheless, sociological approaches to social psychology remain an important counterpart to psychological research in this area. Social psychology reached maturity in both theory and method during the 1980s and 1990s. Careful ethical standards now regulate research, and greater pluralism and multicultural perspectives have emerged. Modern researchers are interested in a variety of phenomena, but attribution, social cognition, and self-concept are perhaps the greatest areas of growth. Social psychologists have also maintained their applied interests, with contributions in health and environmental psychology, as well as the psychology of the legal system. Social psychology is the study of how social conditions affect human beings. Scholars in this field are generally either psychologists or sociologists, though all social psychologists employ both the individual and the group as their units of analysis. Despite their similarity, the disciplines tend to differ in their respective goals, approaches, methods, and terminology. They also favor separate academic journals and professional societies. Social psychology experiments in its simplest form. Experimentation is a method of determining the presence or absence of a causal relationship between two variables by systematically manipulating one variable called the independent variable and assessing its effect on another variable called the dependent variable. Some scholars have questioned the utility of experimentation, noting that the experiments which researchers design sometimes do not resemble the circumstances that people encounter in their everyday lives. However, experimentation is the only research method that allows one to definitively establish the existence of a causal relationship between two or more variables. Social psychology research methods. Social psychologists typically explain human behavior as a result of the interaction of mental states and immediate, social situations. In Kurt Lewin's 1951, heuristic behavior can be viewed as a function of the person and the environment, B equals FP, E. Experimental methods involve the researcher altering a variable in the environment and measuring the effect on another variable. An example would be allowing two groups of children to play violent or nonviolent video games, and then observing their subsequent level of aggression during free play period. A valid experiment is controlled and uses random assignment. Co-relational methods examine the statistical association between two naturally occurring variables. For example, one could correlate the amount of violent television children watch at home with the number of violent incidents the children participate in at school. Note that this study would not prove that violent TV causes aggression in children. It is quite possible that aggressive children choose to watch more violent TV programs. Observational methods are purely descriptive and include naturalistic observation, contrived observation, participant observation, and archival analysis. These are less common in social psychology but are sometimes used when first investigating a phenomenon. An example would be to unobtrusively observe children on a playground with a video camera, perhaps, and record the number and types of aggressive actions displayed. Whenever possible, social psychologists rely on controlled experimentation. Controlled experiments require the manipulation of one or more independent variables in order to examine the effect on a dependent variable. Experiments are useful in social psychology because they are high in internal validity, meaning that they are free from the influence of confounding or extraneous variables, and so are more likely to accurately indicate a causal relationship. However, the small samples used in controlled experiments are typically low in external validity, or the degree to which the results can be generalized to the larger population. There is usually a trade-off between experimental control, internal validity, and being able to generalize to the population, external validity. Because it is usually impossible to test everyone, research tends to be conducted on a sample of persons from the wider population. Social psychologists frequently use survey research when they are interested in results that are high in external validity. Surveys use various forms of random sampling to obtain a sample of respondents that are representative of a population. This type of research is usually descriptive or co-relational because there is no experimental control over variables. However, new statistical methods, like structural equation modeling, are being used to test for potential causal relationships in this type of data. Regardless of which method is used, it is important to evaluate the research hypothesis in the light of the results, either confirming or rejecting the original prediction. Social psychologists use statistics and probability testing to judge their results, which define a significant finding as less than 5% likely to be due to chance. Replications are important to ensure that the result is valid and not due to chance or some feature of a particular sample. Social psychology ethics. The goal of social psychology is to understand cognition and behavior as they naturally occur in a social context, but the very act of observing people can influence and alter their behavior. For this reason, many social psychology experiments utilize deception to conceal or distort certain aspects of the study. Deception may include false cover stories, false participants, known as confederates or stooges, false feedback given to the participants, and so on. The practice of deception has been challenged by some psychologists who maintain that deception under any circumstances is unethical, and that other research strategies such as role-playing should be used instead. Unfortunately, research has shown that role-playing studies do not produce the same results as deception studies, and this has cast doubt on their validity. In addition to deception, experimenters have at times put people into potentially uncomfortable or embarrassing situations, for example, Milgram's obedience to authorities experiments, Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, and this has also been criticized for ethical reasons. To protect the rights and well-being of research participants, and at the same time discover meaningful results and insights into human behavior, virtually all social psychology research must pass an ethical review process. At most colleges and universities, this is conducted by an ethics committee or institutional review board. This group examines the proposed research to make sure that no harm is done to the participants, and that the benefits of the study outweigh any possible risks or discomforts to people taking part in the study. Furthermore, a process of informed consent is often used to make sure that volunteers know what will happen in the experiment and understand that they are allowed to quit the experiment at any time. A debriefing is typically done at the conclusion of the experiment in order to reveal any deceptions used and generally make sure that the participants are unharmed by the procedures. Today, most research in social psychology involves no more risk of harm than can be expected from routine psychological testing or normal daily activities. Social psychology theories. The breadth and range of contemporary social psychology theories reflects the diverse intellectual origins of the various perspectives and approaches. Early discussions of social psychology focused on these distinctive intellectual origins by highlighting the differences between psychological and sociological social psychology. This representation of the field has been critiqued for its perpetuation of artificial boundaries that overlook significant connections between the shared subject matter of sociology and psychology. In 1980, Sheldon Stryker articulated three phases of social psychology: psychological social psychology, sociological social psychology, and symbolic interactionism. While each perspective represents unique theoretical ideas, they also inform one another and serve to create a comprehensive understanding of individual interactions and how they impact on the groups to which we belong, as well as the environments in which group interactions occur. All three perspectives share a focus on the individual and individual interactions as the explanatory factor for all aspects of social life, such as the creation of stable group structures and the formation of successful social movements. The three theoretical perspectives in social psychology, known more generally as cognitive and intrapersonal, symbolic interactionist, and structural, each represent different origins and intellectual affiliations and maintain a focus on different aspects of the individual and society. 1. Action identification theory. Action identification theory definition. People usually know what they are doing, intend to do, or have done in the past. How people achieve an unambiguous understanding of their behavior is rather remarkable when one considers the variety of ways in which any action can be identified. Taking a test, for example, could be identified as showing one's knowledge, earning a grade, or answering questions. Action identification theory, developed by Robin Valacher and Daniel Wegner, specifies the principles by which people adopt a single act identity for their behavior and outlines the conditions under which people maintain this act identity or adopt a new one. The interplay of these principles has implications for central issues in social psychology, including self-regulation, vulnerability to social influence, and self-concept. Action identification and behavior. The potential identities for an action, although diverse by many criteria, are hierarchically related in an identity structure. Lower-level identities in this structure convey the details of the action and thus indicate how the action is done. Higher-level identities convey a more general understanding of the action, indicating why the action is done or what its effects and implications are. Identification level is relative, so whether a particular identity is considered a means or an end, a detail or an implication, depends on the identity with which it is compared. The hierarchical level of two identities is indicated when a person performs one act identity by performing another. Showing one's knowledge is a higher-level identity than taking a test, for example, because one does the former by doing the latter rather than vice versa. Taking a test, however, is a high-level identity with respect to answering questions, since one takes a test by answering questions. Action identification is important for the personal control of behavior. Principle 1 of the theory holds that action is undertaken with respect to the act identity that stands out in consciousness. This means that people have an idea of what they are doing or want to do and use this act identity as a frame of reference for implementing the action and monitoring its occurrence. Because act identities exist at different levels in an identity structure, this principle specifies that people can perform an action at different levels. A person may intend to give a speech, for instance, and monitor his or her behavior to see whether this intention has been fulfilled, or the person may intend to talk in a deliberate tone, a lower-level identity, or persuade others, a higher-level identity, and monitor the attainment of whichever identity is foremost in his or her mind. Change in action identification. Action identification is a dynamic process, undergoing periods of stability and change in accordance with two principles. Principle 2 holds that when both a lower and a higher-level act identity are available, there is a tendency for the higher-level identity to become dominant. This means that people prefer to think about their behavior in terms of its goals, effects, and implications, rather than in terms of its more mechanistic components. Thus, when a person has only a low-level understanding of his or her behavior, he or she is predisposed to adopt a higher-level identity offered by other people or made available by the action context. If the person is induced to think about the details of his or her behavior in a recent interaction, for example, he or she is sensitive to how this behavior is identified by other people, because such feedback may provide a more comprehensive, higher-level understanding of the behavior. As a result, the person might come to believe his or her behavior reflects whatever interpersonal tendency, e.g., cooperation or competition, is conveyed in the feedback. If the feedback is evaluative, i.e., flattering versus critical, it can affect the person's self-evaluation. The tendency to embrace new high-level identities in favor of current lower-level identities is referred to as the emergence process. Because people act on the basis of their dominant act identity, the emergence process can promote new courses of action. If a person embraces feedback suggesting that his or her behavior reflects competitiveness, for example, he or she may seek out competitive, as opposed to cooperative, activities in the future. Research has established the relevance of the emergence process for behavior change, including the development of new goals, e.g., college activities, and change in habitual behavior, e.g., alcohol consumption. The emergence process can charge even the simplest act with significance. If it were the only means by which action identification changed, people's minds would be populated by increasingly broad, abstract, and evaluative notions of what they do and what they are like. This possibility is constrained, however, by Principle 3. When an action cannot be maintained in its dominant identity, there is a tendency for a lower-level identity to become dominant. A person may set out to persuade others, for instance, but unless the action is easily accomplished, he or she may have to think about the action in lower-level terms such as, show command of the facts, demonstrate sincerity, or choose the right words. Even if an action is easy, its details may stand out in consciousness if it is somehow disrupted. A poor quality sound system, for example, might disrupt a person's normally persuasive appeal, causing him or her to think about his or her speech clarity or word choice at the expense of the higher level, persuade, identity. An action's lower-level identities also tend to become conscious when performance is imminent rather than in the distant future or distant past, especially if the action is difficult or complex. Optimality and action identification. The principles of the theory work together to promote a level of identification that is most appropriate or optimal for performing the action. There is a press for higher-level action understanding and control, but the emergent identity gives way to lower-level identities if it proves to be an ineffective guide to action execution. But when action control is regained at a lower level, the emergence process is engaged again, making the person sensitive to higher-level identities, including those that differ from the original high-level identities. Over time and with repeated action, the person converges on an identity at a level that enables that individual to perform the action up to his or her capacity. The more difficult or disruption-prone the action, the lower the optimal level of identification. Conversely, action mastery is signaled by optimality at high levels of identification, such that action details are integrated into larger action units, which then become the basis for conscious control of the action. Despite the tendency toward optimality, people sometimes identify what they do at a level that does not reflect the action's difficulty. The potential for non-optimal identification is manifest in two ways. First, the action context can make higher-level identities dominant even when the action's difficulty or unfamiliarity warrants lower-level identification. The promise of external reward, the threat of punishment, evaluation by other people, and competition, for example, all call attention to the outcomes, consequences, and other higher-level meanings of action and thus can impair performance on difficult tasks that require attention to lower-level details. Second, an easy action can be impaired if conscious attention is drawn to its lower-level aspects by some means, e.g., disruption, verbal instruction. Low-level identities are not only unnecessary for easy-to-maintain action, they can also disassemble an action normally integrated with respect to a higher-level understanding. In both cases, non-optimal identification not only impairs performance, but also has been shown to promote anxiety and self-consciousness. Individual differences. Valacher and Wegner developed a scale, the behavioral identification form, to assess people's characteristic level of identification. Research employing this scale has found theoretically meaningful differences between individuals who tend to identify what they do in relatively high-level terms, high-level agents, and those who routinely identify their action in lower-level terms, low-level agents. Specifically, low-level agents demonstrate less expertise across different action domains, have a weaker sense of personal control, are more impulsive, are more vulnerable to social influence, are less certain of what they are like with respect to personality traits, and have a less stable self-concept. Action identification as a dynamical system. In emphasizing the link between mental representations and behavior, action identification theory has clear relevance to models of self-regulation. But the theory also depicts processes that are similar to the operation of self-organizing dynamical systems in many areas of science. Thus, an action can be viewed as a set of interdependent elements, lower-level identities, that influence each other to achieve a coherent macro-level state, a higher-level identity. The interplay between principles 2 and 3, meanwhile, captures the repeated episodes of emergence and disassembly that underlie the evolution of complex systems. This dynamic scenario has been invoked by social psychologists in recent years to establish similarity among very different topics, from the formation of self-concept to the development of social norms and values in society. 2. Attachment theory. Attachment theory definition. An attachment refers to the strong emotional bond that exists between an infant and his or her caretaker. The attachment theory is designed to explain the evolution of that bond, its development, and its implications for human experience and relationships across the life course. Although attachment theory has primarily been a theory of child development, since the 1980s, the theory has had a large impact on social psychological theories of close relationships, emotion regulation, and personality. Attachment theory history and background. Attachment theory was originally developed by John Bowlby, a British psychoanalyst who was attempting to understand why infants experience intense distress when separated from their parents. Bowlby noticed that separated infants would go to extraordinary lengths, e.g., crying, clinging, frantically searching, to either prevent separation from their parents or to re-establish contact with a missing parent. At the time, psychoanalytic writers held that these behaviors were expressions of immature defense mechanisms that were operating to repress emotional pain, but Bowlby observed that such expressions may serve an evolutionary function. Drawing on evolutionary theory, Bowlby postulated that behaviors such as crying and searching were adaptive responses to separation from a primary attachment figure, someone who provides support, protection, and care. Because human infants, like other mammalian infants, cannot feed or protect themselves, they are dependent upon the care and protection of older and stronger adults. Bowlby argued that, over the course of human evolution, infants who were able to maintain proximity to an attachment figure, i.e., by looking cute or by expressing in attachment behaviors, would be more likely to survive to a reproductive age. According to Bowlby, a motivational control system, what he called the attachment behavioral system, was gradually crafted by natural selection to help the child regulate physical proximity to an attachment figure. The attachment behavior system is an important concept in attachment theory because it provides the conceptual link between evolutionary models of human development and modern theories on emotion regulation and personality. According to Bowlby, the attachment system essentially asks the following question: is the attachment figure nearby, accessible, and attentive? If the child perceives the answer to this question to be yes, he or she feels loved, secure, and confident, and, behaviorally, is likely to explore his or her environment, play with others, and be sociable. If, however, the child perceives the answer to this question to be no, the child experiences anxiety and, behaviorally, is likely to exhibit attachment behaviors ranging from a simple visual search for the parent to active following and vocal signaling. These behaviors continue until either the child is able to re-establish a desirable level of physical or psychological proximity to the attachment figure, or until the child wears down, as may happen in the context of a prolonged separation or loss. In such cases, Bowlby believed that the child may develop symptoms of depression. Individual differences in infant attachment patterns. Although Bowlby believed that his theory captured the way attachment operates in most children, he recognized that there are individual differences. Some children, for example, may be more likely to view their parents as inaccessible or distant, perhaps because their parents have not been consistently available in the past. However, it was not until Bowlby's colleague, Mary Ainsworth, began to study infant-parent separations that individual differences in attachment were incorporated formally into attachment theory. Ainsworth and her students developed a technique called the strange situation, a laboratory paradigm for studying infant-parent attachment. In the strange situation, 12-month-old infants and their parents are brought to the laboratory and are separated from one another and then reunited. In the strange situation, most children, i.e., about 60%, behave in the way implied by Bowlby's normative understanding of attachment. Specifically, they become upset when the parent leaves the room, but when he or she returns, they actively seek the parent and are easily comforted by him or her. Children who exhibit this pattern of behavior are often called secure. Other children, about 20% or less, are ill at ease initially and, upon separation, become extremely distressed. Importantly, when reunited with their parents, these children have a difficult time being soothed and often exhibit conflicting behaviors that suggest they want to be comforted but that they also want to punish the parent for leaving. These children are often called anxious resistant. The third pattern of attachment that Ainsworth and her colleagues documented is called avoidant. Avoidant children, about 20%, don't appear too distressed by the separation and, upon reunion, actively avoid seeking contact with their parent, sometimes turning their attention to play objects on the laboratory floor. Ainsworth's work was important for at least 3 reasons. First, she provided one of the first empirical demonstrations of how attachment behavior is patterned in both safe and frightening contexts. Second, she provided the first empirical taxonomy of individual differences in infant attachment patterns. According to her research, at least 3 types of children exist: those who are secure in their relationship with their parents, those who are anxious resistant, and those who are anxious avoidant. Finally, she demonstrated that these individual differences were correlated with infant-parent interactions in the home during the first year of life. Children who appear secure in the strange situation, for example, tend to have parents who are responsive to their needs. Children who appear insecure in the strange situation, i.e., anxious resistant or anxious avoidant, often have parents who are insensitive to their needs, or inconsistent or rejecting in the care they provide. Attachment in adult romantic relationships. Although Bowlby was primarily focused on understanding the nature of the infant-caregiver relationship, he believed that attachment played a role in human experience across the life course. It was not until the mid-1980s, however, that psychologists began to take seriously the possibility that attachment may play a role in adulthood. Cindy Hazan and Phil Shaver were 2 of the first researchers to explore Bowlby's ideas in the context of romantic relationships. According to Hazan and Shaver, the emotional bond that develops between adult romantic partners is partly a function of the same motivational system, the attachment behavioral system, that gives rise to the emotional bond between infants and their caregivers. Hazan and Shaver noted that infants and caregivers and adult romantic partners share the following features: both feel safe when the other is nearby and responsive. Both engage in close, intimate, bodily contact. Both feel insecure when the other is inaccessible. Both share discoveries with one another. Both play with one another's facial features and exhibit a mutual fascination and preoccupation with one another. Both engage in baby talk, or motherese, i.e., a high-pitched, idiosyncratic language that involves made-up words that only the couple understands. On the basis of these parallels, Hazan and Shaver argued that adult romantic relationships, like infant-caregiver relationships, are attachments, and that romantic love is a property of the attachment behavioral system, as well as the motivational systems that give rise to caregiving and sexuality. 3 implications of adult attachment theory. The idea that romantic relationships may be attachment relationships has had a profound influence on modern research on close relationships. There are at least 3 critical implications of this idea. First, if adult romantic relationships are attachment relationships, then we should observe the same kinds of individual differences in adult relationships that Ainsworth observed in infant-caregiver relationships. Second, if adult romantic relationships are attachment relationships, then the way adult relationships work should be similar to the way infant-caregiver relationships work. Third, whether an adult is secure or insecure in his or her adult relationships may be a partial reflection of his or her attachment experiences in early childhood. Do we observe the same kinds of attachment patterns among adults that we observe among children? If adult romantic relationships are attachment relationships, then the same kinds of individual differences that Ainsworth observed in infant-caregiver relationships should be observed in adult relationships. Some adults, for example, may be expected to be secure in their close relationships, feeling confident that their partners will be there for them when needed and being open to depending on others and having others depend on them. Other adults, in contrast, will be expected to be insecure in their relationships. For example, some insecure adults may be anxious resistant, they worry that others may not love them completely, and they may be easily frustrated or angered when their attachment needs go unmet. Others may be avoidant, they may appear not to care too much about close relationships and may prefer not to be too dependent upon other people or to have others be too dependent upon them. The earliest research on adult attachment involved studying the association between individual differences in adult attachment and the way people think about their relationships and their memories for what their relationships with their parents are like. In 1987, Hazan and Shaver developed a simple questionnaire to measure these individual differences. These individual differences are often referred to as attachment styles, attachment patterns, attachment orientations, or differences in the organization of the attachment system. In short, Hazan and Shaver asked research subjects to read 3 paragraphs and indicate which paragraph best characterized the way they think, feel, and behave in close relationships. Paragraph A described discomfort and nervousness in being close to others, as well as difficulty with trust and intimacy. Paragraph B depicted relative ease with closeness to and mutual dependence with others, and paragraph C indicated a perception that others are hesitant to get close as desired and that a partner doesn't love them or likely won't want to stay with them. Hazan and Shaver found that the number of people endorsing each of these descriptions was similar to the number of children classified as secure, anxious, or avoidant in infancy. In other words, about 60% of adults classified themselves as secure paragraph B, about 20% described themselves as avoidant paragraph A, and about 20% described themselves as anxious resistant paragraph C. Do adult romantic relationships work in the same way that infant caregiver relationships work? If adult romantic relationships are attachment relationships, then the way adult relationships work should be similar to the way infant caregiver relationships work. For the most part, research suggests that adult romantic relationships function in ways that are similar to infant caregiver relationships. Naturalistic research on adults separating from their partners at an airport demonstrated that behaviors indicative of attachment, such as crying and clinging, were evident and that the way people expressed those behaviors was related to their attachment style. For example, while separating couples generally showed more attachment behavior than non-separating couples, people with avoidant attachment styles showed much less attachment behavior. There is also research that suggests that the same kinds of features that mothers desire in their babies are also desired by adults seeking a romantic partner. Studies conducted in numerous cultures suggest that the secure pattern of attachment in infancy is universally considered the most desirable pattern by mothers. Adults seeking long-term relationships identify responsive caregiving qualities, such as attentiveness, warmth, and sensitivity, as most attractive in potential dating partners. Despite the attractiveness of secure qualities, however, not all adults are paired with secure partners. Some evidence suggests that people end up in relationships with partners who confirm their existing beliefs about attachment relationships, even if those beliefs are negative. Are attachment patterns stable from infancy to adulthood? An important implication of attachment theory is that whether an adult is secure or insecure in his or her adult relationships may be a partial reflection of his or her attachment experiences in early childhood. Bowlby believed that the mental representations or working models, i.e., expectations, beliefs, rules, or scripts, for behaving and thinking that a child holds regarding relationships are a function of his or her caregiving experiences. For example, a secure child tends to believe that others will be there for him or her because previous experiences have led him or her to this conclusion. Once a child has developed such expectations, he or she will tend to seek out relational experiences that are consistent with those expectations and perceive others in a way that is colored by those beliefs. According to Bowlby, this kind of process should promote continuity in attachment patterns over the life course, although it is possible that a person's attachment pattern will change if his or her relational experiences are inconsistent with his or her expectations. In short, if we assume that adult relationships are attachment relationships, it is possible that children who are secure as children will grow up to be secure in their romantic relationships. Research shows that there is a modest degree of overlap between how secure people feel with their mothers, for example, and how secure they feel with their romantic partners. For example, among people who are securely attached to their mothers, over 65% of them are likely to feel secure with their romantic partners too. There is also evidence suggesting that people who are secure as children are more likely to grow up to become secure adults. Of secure adults, approximately 70% of them were classified as secure when they were 12 months of age in the strange situation. Taken together, these data suggest that there is a moderate degree of stability in attachment styles from infancy to adulthood, but that there is also plenty of room for people's ongoing experiences to shape their security. 3. Attribution theory definition attribution theory, or rather, a family of attribution theories, is concerned with the question of how ordinary people explain human behavior. One type of attribution theory emphasizes people's use of folk psychology to detect and understand internal states such as goals, desires, or intentions. People then use these inferred states to explain the behavior they observe. Another type of attribution theory assumes that people observe regularities and differences in behavior to learn about dispositions, e.g., personality traits, attitudes that are characteristic of themselves or others. Attribution theories pose a challenge to academic efforts to account for behavior that either fail to explain the individual behaviors of individual people or that deny the usefulness of folk psychological or mentalistic concepts. Attribution theories are complemented by what is sometimes called attributional theories. These theories address the consequences of particular attributions for emotions, e.g., anger versus pity, judgments, e.g., of guilt versus innocence, and behavior, e.g., aggression versus assistance. Attribution as perception. In 1958, Fritz Heider introduced an early version of attribution theory at a time when behaviorist theories of learning and memory and psychoanalytic theories of unconscious motivation dominated academic psychology. These theories had little use for naive explanations of behavior. In contrast, Heider stressed the importance of studying everyday attributions because they influence how people feel and what they do. Heider made two important distinctions. The first distinction was whether a behavior is seen as intentional or unintentional. The second distinction was whether a behavior is seen as caused by something about the person or by something about the situation. These two distinctions are related because intentional behaviors say more about the person than about the situation. Heider anticipated that people regard personal attributions as most important. Individualist cultures, in particular, foster a tendency to see humans as autonomous agents who have some control over their own behavior. Once they have made a personal attribution, people can predict a person's future behavior more confidently. Suppose Ringo repays a loan from Paul on time. If Paul concludes that Ringo is trustworthy, he may help him again when the need arises, or feel comfortable to trust Ringo in other ways, as when confiding a piece of gossip about George. The repayment of a loan is likely seen as an intentional act, especially when there are no signs that the person was coerced. Heider suggested that an attribution of intentionality can be made with little thought, much like the visual perception of objects is largely automatic. In social perception, the person and the behavior form a perceptual unit, and thereby suggest a causal connection. Experiments have shown that the observation of a behavior that implies a certain personality trait, such as the timely repayment of a loan, suggests trustworthiness, makes that trait mentally accessible. If, for example, people read about a repaid loan and a host of other behaviors, seeing the word trustworthy at a later time helps them recall the specific behavior that suggested it. Whereas the person-behavior unit is figural in social perception, the situation is usually the background. Compared with a person, a situation is typically not well organized perceptually. It can comprise the presence of other people, current moods, the weather, or the time of day. Only when a particular aspect of a situation commands attention, such as the threat of penalties in the loan example, can situational attributions become more prominent. The attribution of an intentional, and thus personal, causation is furthered if the actor exerts effort. If we learn that Ringo recently took a second job, we feel more confident about his intention to repay the loan. In general, if a person appears to go the extra mile to produce a desired effect, people attribute the behavior to a conscious goal. The third, and perhaps the strongest cue toward intentionality is what Heider called equifinality. Equifinality can only be revealed by several behaviors that lead to the same end result. Courting behavior is an example. A suitor who sends flowers, cards, and chocolates, and who also serenades the object of his desire really seems to mean it. Note that these cues are not independent. He who seeks many means to achieve the same end can often only do so by exerting more effort than he who is more nonchalant. Attribution as inference. In 1965, Edward Jones and Keith Davis proposed the more formal theory of correspondent inferences. They stressed that attributions of intentionality depend on the impression that the actor freely chose what to do. There had to be alternative options as well as a lack of situational pressures, such as coercion by others. A chosen option is most informative if its alternatives differ in their consequences, and if the person was able to foresee these consequences. For example, we can learn about Ringo's intentions from what he did with the money he borrowed. Suppose he had the options of buying a lawn mower, a new computer, or a cruise for his wife. Choosing the last option is most informative because it has the unique consequence of affirming an important personal relationship. The question of free choice became a watershed issue for all attribution theories because it most clearly separates personal from situational causes. Originally, Jones and his colleagues believed that people would discount personal explanations if a behavior was externally constrained. In a famous experiment in 1967, Jones and Victor Harris found, however, that people thought a person who, in compliance with an experimenter's request, had written an essay in praise of Fidel Castro, privately held pro-Castro attitudes. The tendency to make inferences about the person even when the situation could fully explain the behavior, was henceforth called the correspondence bias, or more evocatively, the fundamental attribution error. In short, the theory of correspondent inferences assumed that the road from behaviors to dispositional attributions is a rocky one because of the multiplicity of considerations that is presumably necessary. In contrast, the evidence for quick and potentially biased inferences suggests that people make use of perceptual shortcuts, just as Heider had suspected. Some of these shortcuts are self-serving. People readily attribute successes and other positive events to their own efforts or enduring qualities, while attributing failures or other setbacks to chance or to features of the situation, e.g., the test was unfair. Although self-serving biases are suspect from a normative point of view, they have adaptive benefits. People who attribute successes to their own ability and their failures to bad luck are less likely to be depressed and more likely to persevere after setbacks. These biases are truly self-serving only if they are unique to the self-perspective, that is, if the favorable explanatory pattern does not affect explanations of the behaviors or outcomes of others. A more general bias is the actor-observer effect, which refers to the tendency to make fewer dispositional or more situational attributions for one's own behavior than for the behavior of others. This effect turns out to be rather weak. Bertram Mal has suggested that the main difference between the self and the observer's perspective is that the former heavily relies on reasons as explanations, whereas the latter relies on causes. Reasons are derived from intentions, which people find available in their own minds but can only infer from the behavior or others. Causes include all situational sources of behavior as well as personal dispositions that lie outside the realm of intentional action, e.g., habits, compulsions, automatisms. Attribution as induction perceptions and inferences regarding intentionality and causality can involve a fair amount of guesswork. Their quality depends on the perceiver's ability to make reasonable assumptions to make up for missing information. Harold Kelly suggested that attributions are a certain kind of inductive inference. That is, people induce a probable cause from available information. Following the British empiricists, and particularly John Stuart Mill's joint method of agreement and difference, Kelly proposed that an event, e.g., a behavior, is attributed to whichever potential cause is present when the event is present and that is absent when the event is absent. In Kelly's scheme, there are three sources of variability. Variability over actors is called consensus. Consensus is low if only Ringo, but no one else, repays his loan. It suggests that Ringo, but not Paul, should be credited as the source of Ringo's behavior. Variability over stimuli is called distinctiveness. Distinctiveness is high if Ringo only repays Paul but not George, suggesting that Paul has some control over Ringo's behavior. Finally, variability over time is called consistency. Consistency is high if the behavior occurs repeatedly, as when, for example, Ringo always repays his loans. By itself, consistent behavior does not reveal much about its likely cause. If, however, consensus or distinctiveness information already suggests a particular attribution, high consistency makes this attribution more certain. A full suite of information concerning consensus, distinctiveness, and consistency is called a configuration. On the basis of such a configuration, a social perceiver can decide whether to attribute a behavior to the person, to the stimulus, to the particular relationship between the two, or to the circumstances prevailing at the time. With each of the three types of information being either high or low, 8 different configurations are possible. The configuration of low consensus, low distinctiveness, and high consistency affords the strongest person attribution. The configuration of high consensus, high distinctiveness, and high consistency affords the strongest stimulus attribution. Over the years, numerous refinements to Kelly's model have been introduced. The goal of these efforts has been to identify unique predictions for each possible configuration, and to validate these predictions with empirical data about how social perceivers actually make attributions. Patricia Cheng's and Laura Novick's probabilistic contrast model advances these ideas by recognizing the uncertainty of many causal attributions. In their model, an aspect of the world, e.g., a person or a situation, is perceived as a cause if the event, e.g., a behavior, is more likely to occur when this aspect is present than when it is absent. That is, causality is inferred from a difference between probabilities. This theory can account for a complex interplay of causes. Suppose that the probability of Ringo repaying a loan is greater if Paul is the lender than if George is the lender, whereas the probability of John repaying the loan is low regardless of lender. Statistically, this pattern is an interaction. It reveals the unique relationship between Ringo and Paul as the most probable cause. Yet, Kelly's theory leads to the same conclusion, because the pattern of covariation is coded as one with low consensus, high distinctiveness, and high consistency. So what has been gained? Note that Kelly's model ignores the probability of another actor, John, repaying another lender, George. If this probability were high, Ringo's behavior would no longer be unusual, and hence, the attribution of his behavior to his relationship with Paul would also be weakened. Attribution as construction. The probabilistic contrast model is conceptually elegant, mathematically rigorous, and empirically well supported. However, the price for the model's precision is a lack of realism. The Cheng and Novick model, as well as other theories of inductive inference, faces several critical issues, which set the agenda for current and future refinements of attribution theory. The first issue is that ordinary social perceivers rarely have enough information to evaluate configurations of evidence. To make attributions, they must exploit direct perceptual inferences, inferences based on partial cues, or common social background knowledge. Recent integrative models address this problem by combining aspects of the folk psychology approach with the statistical reasoning approach. The second issue is that sources of information are rarely independent. Behavior low in distinctiveness also tends to be highly consistent because people enter different situations sequentially. To untangle distinctiveness from consistency, they must figure out which situations they can treat as identical and how they can mentally correct the conflation of different situations with different times. Formal statistical tools can do this with numerical data, but ordinary intuition is not equipped to handle this task. The third issue is that trait attributions, once made, do not contribute much to the causal explanation of behavior. Once we believe that Ringo is trustworthy, this characteristic of his becomes a mere enabling condition because it is always there. As a trait, trustworthiness is, by definition, a constant feature and therefore cannot vary. To explain a particular trustworthy act, some additional cause must be invoked. When the additional cause is an aspect of the situation, a peculiar shortcoming of standard attribution theory emerges. Since the days of Heider's theory, personal and situational causes have been treated as competitive. Kelly's famous discounting principle states that the stronger the situational cause is, the weaker the personal cause must be. The assumption of a hydraulic relationship between personal and situational causes may not be realistic. People who react aggressively to provocation, for example, are seen as having aggressive personalities, whereas people who aggress without provocation are more likely seen as disturbed. Contrary to the classic logic, a situational stimulus can enable a dispositional attribution, rather than inhibit it. The final and most fundamental issue is that patterns of covariation never prove causation. One can show that a given covariation is not causal, but one cannot prove that a covariation is not causal. Educated people do not believe that the crowing of a rooster calls forth the dawn of a new day even if it consistently precedes it. There is no known mechanism that links the two. In contrast, if a comedian's cracks are always followed by riotous laughter, one can examine the specific properties of the jokes as mediating variables and note the fact that the intervals between jokes can be varied at will. When there is a plausible process, or mediator, variable that can link an effect to a putative cause, the case for causation becomes stronger, but it still is not proven. The problem reduces again to covariation, that is, to the statistical relationships between the presumed cause and the mediator variable, and between the mediator variable and the effect. That there is no end to this, no matter how many mediator variables are inserted, reinforces philosopher David Hume's skepticism regarding causation. Covariations can be accepted as causal only with the aid of perceptions, inferences, or beliefs that lie outside of the field of observable data. Whereas attribution theories call on the concepts of folk psychology to support causal claims, the same concepts remain suspect as pre-scientific from an academic perspective. This leads to the ironic conclusion that ordinary people often have a greater facility in explaining individual behaviors than some formal theories do. Moreover, theories that reject intentions, or conscious will more generally, as a cause of behavior imply that the ordinary person's interest in them must be mistaken. The counterargument is that intentions are no different from other mental phenomena, such as attention, learning, or memory, that many reductionist theories invest with explanatory power. If so, insights gained from folk psychology and formalized by attribution theories can enrich academic theories of human behavior, just as Heider hoped they would. Most scientific theories rely on experimentation to determine the causes of behavior. If experimentation were the royal road to understanding causation, one might demand ordinary people to conduct experiments before making attributions. They usually do not, and they should not be blamed, because experimentation is difficult and costly. Note that such blaming would be an act of attribution. Experimentation has its own limitations. One is that experiments are better suited for the detection of behavioral trends in groups of people than for finding out why a certain person performed a specific act. Another limitation is that personal characteristics such as traits are, by definition, stable and thus not amenable to experimental variation. The most important limitation, however, is the general force of Hume's critique. Causality cannot be established by observation alone. Instead, it requires a psychological contribution that goes beyond the data given. This is true in scientific experimentation as it is in ordinary social perception. Experiments only yield patterns of covariation. The extra knowledge that scientists use to go beyond covariation is their belief that they can replicate experimental results at will. In other words, their own intentions and sense of agency play a crucial role in their conviction that covariations observed in experimental data can keep Hume's specter at bay. By explaining the causal beliefs of behavioral scientists, attribution theory comes full circle. 4. Balance theory definition. Balance theory describes the structure of people's opinions about other individuals and objects as well as the perceived relation between them. The central notion of balance theory is that certain structures between individuals and objects are balanced, whereas other structures are imbalanced, and that balanced structures are generally preferred over imbalanced structures. Specifically, balance theory claims that unbalanced structures are associated with an uncomfortable feeling of negative affect, and that this negative feeling leads people to strive for balanced structures and to avoid imbalanced structures. An example for a balanced structure is when your best friend also likes your favorite rock band. An example for an imbalanced structure is when your best friend dislikes your favorite rock band. According to balance theory, the first case makes you feel good, whereas the second case creates an uncomfortable tension. Theoretical assumptions. The original formulation of balance theory was designed to describe the pattern of relations between three individuals. Such relation patterns between three objects or individuals are often referred to as triadic relations. From a general perspective, a triadic relation between three individuals includes a. The relation between a first person A and a second person O, B. The relation between the second person O and a third person X, and C. The relation between the first person A and the third person X, also described as AOX triad. In addition, it is assumed that the specific relations between two individuals can be positive, i.e., the two individuals like each other, or negative, i.e., the two individuals dislike each other. According to balance theory, a triad is balanced when it includes either no or an even number of negative relations. In contrast, a triad is imbalanced when it includes an odd number of negative relations. For example, the resulting triad of relations between Peter, John, and Paul would be balanced if a. Peter likes John, John likes Paul, and Peter likes Paul. b. Peter likes John, John dislikes Paul, and Peter dislikes Paul. c. Peter dislikes John, John likes Paul, and Peter dislikes Paul. Or d. Peter dislikes John, John dislikes Paul, and Peter likes Paul. However, the resulting triad would be imbalanced if a. Peter dislikes John, John likes Paul, and Peter likes Paul. b. Peter likes John, John dislikes Paul, and Peter likes Paul. c. Peter likes John, John likes Paul, and Peter dislikes Paul. Or d. Peter dislikes John, John dislikes Paul, and Peter dislikes Paul. Even though balance theory was originally developed to explain patterns of interpersonal relations, it has also been applied to study attitudes and opinions about objects. For example, a triad including Sarah, Alice, and country music would be balanced if Sarah likes Alice, Alice likes country music, and Sarah also likes country music. However, the resulting triad would be imbalanced if Sarah likes Alice, Alice likes country music, but Sarah dislikes country music. Over and above these assumptions for personal sentiments, balance theory assumes that a positive relation can also result from the perception that two objects or individuals somehow belong together. Conversely, a negative relation can result from the perception that two objects or individuals do not belong together. Such kinds of relations are typically called unit relations. Positive unit relations can result from any kind of closeness, similarity, or proximity, such as membership in the same soccer team, similar hairstyle, or same ethnic background. In contrast, negative unit relations can result from distance, dissimilarity, or distinctness, such as membership in different soccer teams, different hairstyle, or different ethnic background. Evidence the distinction between balanced and imbalanced triads has been shown to have important implications for a variety of different domains. First, research has shown that the uncomfortable feeling associated with imbalanced patterns influences the formation of new attitudes. Specifically, it has been demonstrated that newly formed attitudes usually complete triadic relations in a manner such that the resulting triad is balanced rather than imbalanced. For example, if Sarah learns that a yet unknown individual is liked by her friend Alice, Sarah will form a positive attitude toward this individual. However, if Sarah learns that the same individual is disliked by her friend Alice, Sarah will form a negative attitude toward this individual. Second, research has demonstrated a general superiority in memory for balanced as compared to imbalanced information. For instance, people show higher accuracy in recalling balanced patterns such as Peter likes John, John dislikes Paul, and Peter dislikes Paul. However, people show lower accuracy in recalling imbalanced patterns such as Peter likes John, John dislikes Paul, and Peter likes Paul. This difference in memory performance is even more pronounced when the triad includes the perceiver, e.g., I like John, John dislikes Paul, and I dislike Paul. Third, balance principles have been shown to have important implications for people's identity and the way people feel about themselves. Research in this area has shown that mental associations between the self and a particular group, evaluations of this group, and personal evaluations of oneself typically show patterns that can be described as balanced rather than imbalanced. For instance, if a black person has a strong mental association between the self and the category black, and in addition shows a positive evaluation of the category black, this person will also exhibit a positive self-evaluation, i.e., I'm black, black is good, therefore I'm good. However, if a black person has a strong mental association between the self and the category black, but shows a negative evaluation of the category black, this person will likely exhibit a negative self-evaluation, i.e., I'm black, black is bad, therefore I'm bad. According to balance theory, this transfer of evaluations is due to the inherent unit between the self and the category black. 5. Broaden and build theory. The broaden and build theory of positive emotions was developed to explain why people experience positive emotions. What purpose might be served by fleeting feelings of joy, gratitude, serenity, or love? Did such pleasant states confer adaptive value over the course of human evolution? Within prior theories of emotions, positive emotions posed a puzzle. This was because most prior accounts rested on the assumption that all emotions, both pleasant and unpleasant, were adaptive to human ancestors because they produced urges to act in particular ways, by triggering specific action tendencies. Fear, for instance, is linked with the urge to flee, anger with the urge to attack, disgust the urge to expel, and so on. A core idea within the concept of specific action tendencies is that having these particular actions spring to mind made emotions evolutionary adaptive because such quick and decisive actions helped early humans to survive specific threats to life or limb. Another core idea is that specific action tendencies are embodied thoughts. As they overtake conscious thought, they also trigger rapid bodily changes that support the actions called forth. If you, at this moment, saw danger looming and were experiencing fear, you would not only experience an overwhelming urge to flee to safety, but also within milliseconds your cardiovascular system would have switched gears to redirect oxygenated blood to large muscles so that you'd be physically ready to run away. The major contribution made by the concept of specific action tendencies, then, was to explain why emotions infuse both mind and body and how the forces of natural selection might have shaped and preserved emotions as part of universal human nature. The trouble with the concept of specific action tendencies came when past theorists tried to pinpoint the tendencies sparked by positive emotions. Joy had been linked to the urge to do anything, and serenity with the urge to do nothing. Not only were these urges vague and nonspecific, it's doubtful whether doing nothing is an action at all. Positive emotions, then, did not fit the theoretical mold that worked so well for negative emotions. Noticing this puzzle and other intriguing features of positive emotions, Barbara L. Fredrickson offered the broaden and build theory to explain the evolved adaptive significance of positive emotions. The broaden and build theory holds that, unlike negative emotions, which narrow people's ideas about possible actions through specific action tendencies, positive emotions broaden people's ideas about possible actions, opening their awareness to wider ranges of thoughts and actions than are typical for them. Joy, for instance, sparks the urge to play and be creative, interest sparks the urge to explore and learn, and serenity sparks the urge to savor current circumstances and integrate them into new self-views and worldviews. Whereas the narrowed mindsets sparked by negative emotions were adaptive in instances that threatened survival in some way, the broadened mindsets sparked by positive emotions were adaptive in different ways and over longer time scales. Broadened mindsets were adaptive because, over time, such expansive awareness served to build humans' resources, spurring on their development, and equipping them to better handle subsequent and inevitable threats to survival. To illustrate, consider the playful mindset sparked by joy. Ethological research documents that as complex organisms play with conspecifics, they forge social alliances, i.e., friendships. In times of trouble, these gains in social resources might spell the difference between life and death. Consider also the urge to explore novel environments sparked by interest. Behavioral research documents that positive and open mindsets, because they yield exploration and experiential learning, produce more accurate cognitive maps of the local environment, relative to negative and rejecting mindsets. Such gains in intellectual resources might again spell the difference between life and death in certain circumstances. The broaden and build theory states that positive emotions were adaptive to one's human ancestors because, over time, positive states and their associated broadened mindsets could accumulate and compound in ways that transformed individuals for the better, leaving them with more social, psychological, intellectual, and physical resources than they would have otherwise had. When these ancestors later faced inevitable threats to life and limb, their greater resources would have translated into better odds of survival and of living long enough to reproduce. To the extent that the capacity to experience positive emotions was genetically encoded, this capacity would have been shaped by natural selection in ways that explain the form and function of the positive emotions that modern-day humans experience. Since its inception, the broaden and build theory has been tested and supported by a wide range of empirical research. Controlled laboratory experiments document that, compared to neutral and negative states, induced positive emotions widen the scope of people's attention, expand their repertoires of possible actions, and create openness to new experiences. Prospective field studies show that people who, for whatever reasons, experience more positive emotions than others are better equipped to deal with life's adversities and challenges. Last but not least, randomized controlled tests of interventions designed to augment people's positive emotions, like practicing meditation or cultivating the habit of counting blessings, have documented that these interventions build people's enduring resources, including immune functioning, mindfulness, and relationship closeness. At a practical level, the Broaden and build theory gives modern-day humans reason to cultivate and cherish positive emotions. Pleasant states like joy, interest, serenity, gratitude, and love do not merely feel good in the moment, but they also place people on trajectories toward positive growth. As these positive emotions accumulate and compound, they pave the way for people to reach their higher ground, to become healthier, more knowledgeable, more resilient, and more socially integrated versions of themselves. 6. Cognitive dissonance theory. Cognitive dissonance theory definition introduced by Leon Festinger in 1957, and since that time debated, refined, and debated again by psychologists. Cognitive dissonance is defined as the aversive state of arousal that occurs when a person holds two or more cognitions that are inconsistent with each other. The concept of dissonance was once enormously controversial, but its support through 5 decades of research has made it one of the most widely accepted concepts in social psychology. Cognitive dissonance theory can explain a variety of ordinary and extraordinary events in our social lives. Indeed, for a concept to have as long and active a shelf life as dissonance, it must either help us see our social world differently, help us to understand why certain phenomena occur, or allow us to make and confirm interesting and non-obvious predictions about human nature. The theory of cognitive dissonance has accomplished all three. To break the definition into its components, let us consider first what is meant by inconsistent cognitions, for it is the simultaneous holding of inconsistent cognitions that gives rise to the experience of dissonance. Festinger thought of a cognition as any piece of knowledge that we have. We can have knowledge about our beliefs, our behavior, our feelings, or about the state of the environment. We may have dozens of cognitions of which we are at least dimly aware at any moment in time, and innumerable more of which we can become aware once our attention or memory is set in motion. Most of the cognitions that we have are not related to each other in any obvious way. For example, my knowledge that I am hungry and my knowledge that the Earth travels around the Sun are two cognitions, but my hunger bears no relationship to the trajectory of the planets. However, some cognitions are directly related. My knowledge that I am hungry is very much related to my behavior at the local restaurant in which I am sitting. If I order a meal, the knowledge of that behavior is related to my knowledge that I'm hungry. In fact, it is quite consistent with my hunger. However, if I decide to forego the meal, or simply order a cup of coffee, my ordering behavior is again related to my hunger, but this time it is inconsistent. Cognitive dissonance is all about the consequences of inconsistency. We prefer consistency to inconsistency and work hard to maintain or restore consistency among our cognitions. Failing to order food to allay my hunger at the restaurant, I may convince myself that I was not really that hungry, or that the restaurant's food was bad. In this way, the inconsistency between my knowledge of my hunger and the decision not to purchase food would seem more consistent. In many ways, the need to restore consistency is similar to the familiar concept of rationalization. Indeed, rationalization is one way to deal with the dilemma posed by inconsistent cognitions. Formally, the state of cognitive dissonance occurs when a person holds one cognition that follows from the obverse of another cognition. For example, not ordering food at the restaurant would follow from the obverse or opposite of being hungry. If I were full, I would not be expected to order food. But I was not full, and thus the decision to refrain from eating would follow from the obverse of my knowledge that I was hungry. The condition for dissonance is met. How does cognitive dissonance feel? Dissonance is experienced as an unpleasant emotion, akin to feeling uncomfortable, bothered, or tense. In addition, dissonance is motivational. When we experience dissonance, we are motivated to reduce it, much like the way we are motivated to reduce physical drives such as hunger and thirst. The more dissonance we experience, the more we are motivated to find a way to reduce it. This need can lead to the kinds of rationalizing behaviors, such as those encountered in the restaurant scenario. Not ordering food when hungry creates a state of cognitive dissonance. Rationalizing, by convincing ourselves that we were not so hungry after all, reduces the inconsistency and thereby reduces the unpleasant state of dissonance. The history of cognitive dissonance research, predictions and findings choices the occasions that cause us to experience dissonance are ubiquitous. Whenever we make a choice, there is the potential for dissonance. Imagine that you are purchasing an automobile. It is a tough choice with many alternatives from which to choose. Let's say you have narrowed the field to your two favorite options, a slightly used BMW and a brand new Neon. You consider the pros and cons of each car. The BMW is fast, gorgeous, and attracts positive attention. The Neon is new, so you can get a full selection of colors and a multi-year warranty. On the other hand, the BMW, being old, is more likely to break down, the cost of repairs is high, and you must take it in green. The downside of the Neon, you believe, is that it is slow, less attractive, and handles sluggishly. You choose the BMW, satisfied that, on balance, it provided more of what you were looking for than the Neon. But wait, you have now selected a car that has several negative features. What if it breaks down? What if your friends hate the color green? And what do you do about the features of the Neon that you are giving up? You liked the warranty, and now you don't have it. You liked the price, but you've now spent more money buying the BMW. All of these thoughts are inconsistent with your decision to buy the BMW. According to the theory of cognitive dissonance, you experience an unpleasant tension. Each time you think of a cognition that supported the Neon over the BMW, your tension rises. You are driven to reduce it. What can you do? Here are some possibilities. You can increase the importance of some of the factors that caused you to like the BMW in the first place. Suddenly, speed seems like the most important dimension you can think of when it comes to buying a car. B. You can reduce the importance of some of the good features of the Neon. For example, you decide that warranties are often deceptive and the parts of cars that break are usually not covered. C. You can add cognitions that support your choice that you hadn't considered previously. You may think about how many more people will be friends with you when you drive the BMW, or how many people would have thought you were dull if you had picked the Neon. In the end, you may perform any or all of the cognitive changes that help you reduce your dissonance. And there is a measurable consequence to these cognitive changes. When you made your choice, you liked the BMW a bit more than you liked the Neon. By the time you are finished with your rationalizations and distortions that have been at the service of reducing cognitive dissonance, you will like the BMW much better than that now boring little Neon. The predictions in the automobile purchasing scenario were confirmed in the first reported laboratory research on cognitive dissonance. In his 1956 study, Jack W. Brem asked consumers to rate a variety of household items such as blenders and toasters. He told the consumers that they would be able to take home one of two items from the longer list of products. To create a high degree of dissonance, similar to the automobile example, Brem asked the participants to choose between two highly attractive, closely related products. Brem predicted that, just like the hypothetical BMW example, the consumers would rate the chosen product much more highly than they had rated it previously, and that they would downgrade the product that they did not choose. This is exactly what happened. 7. Correspondent inference theory. Correspondent inference theory definition. A correspondent inference, sometimes also called a correspondent trait inference, is a judgment that a person's personality matches or corresponds to his or her behavior. For example, if we notice that Talia is behaving in a friendly manner and we infer that she has a friendly personality, we have made, or drawn, a correspondent inference. Or, if we notice that Carl is behaving in an aggressive manner and we conclude that he is an aggressive sort of person, we have drawn a correspondent inference. Sometimes it is reasonable to infer that people's personalities correspond to their behavior, and sometimes it is not reasonable. Correspondent inference theory outlines when it is appropriate to infer that a person's personality corresponds to his or her behavior. Correspondent inference theory background. Correspondent inference theory was developed by E. Jones, often called Ned Jones, and his colleagues. It falls into the domain of social psychology known as attribution theory, which is the study of judgments that people draw from behavior. Correspondent inference theory has been revised over the years, but the original formulation of the theory was published by Jones and Keith Davis in 1965. The 1960s through most of the 1970s was a period of time in social psychology when logic and rationality were emphasized. As such, it is not surprising that correspondent inference theory has a very logical flavor. Jones and Daniel McGillis later said that the theory described a rational model for how correspondent inferences could be drawn but did not necessarily describe how people actually draw correspondent inferences. Explanation of the correspondent inference theory. According to correspondent inference theory, two factors are important to consider in determining when it is appropriate to infer that a person's personality corresponds to his or her behavior. 1. If the person's behavior is what most people would be expected to do in that situation, then it is not reasonable to infer that the person's personality corresponds to his or her behavior. This is the same as Harold Kelly's discounting principle, which suggests that we should not consider a person's behavior to be informative about personality when the situation would cause most people to behave that way. For example, suppose you turn on the television and a game show is on. The contestant answers a question and wins a new BMW Mini Cooper. She smiles, jumps up and down, and looks very happy. Would you infer that because she looks really happy she must have a happy personality? Obviously not. Most people, whether they have happy personalities or not, would behave in a happy manner after winning a new car. So, when people behave just how we would expect most people to behave in that situation, correspondent inference theory suggests that we should not infer that personality corresponds to behavior. 2. If it is not clear what trait the behavior suggests, then it is also not reasonable to draw a correspondent inference. For example, suppose the contestant goes on to win a $650 mountain bike, a laptop computer, $25,000 in cash, and a Caribbean cruise. Mysteriously, the contestant tells the host that she will not go on the cruise. That is probably not how most people would behave, so it would be reasonable to infer something. But, it is not clear what trait to infer. Is the contestant afraid of the ocean? Does the contestant not like hot weather? Could there be some medical reason? Family? School? Work? So, even if the person's behavior is not expected in that situation, correspondent inference theory suggests that it is not reasonable to draw a correspondent inference if we do not know what trait to infer. However, when people do not behave as most people would in a certain situation, and when it is clear what inference to draw, correspondent inference theory suggests that we should infer that personality corresponds to behavior. For example, suppose at a party you see a person named Stan. You notice that Stan easily meets new people, tells jokes, seems very comfortable in interpersonal situations, and generally behaves in an outgoing manner. Not everyone behaves this way, and it is clear what trait to infer. Therefore, correspondent inference theory suggests that we should infer that Stan's personality corresponds to his behavior. Stan probably has an outgoing, sociable, extroverted personality. Correspondent inference theory evidence. There is some evidence consistent with correspondent inference theory. However, what has captured the attention of social psychologists is the fact that people often deviate from the theory. For example, although people recognize to some degree that when a situation tends to make people behave a certain way, that behavior is not very informative about personality, people still tend to infer that personality corresponds somewhat to behavior. So, if people see a contestant behave in a happy manner after winning a car, they might conclude that the contestant has a somewhat happy personality, even though they know that winning a car tends to make people happy. This tendency to infer that personality corresponds to behavior even when the situation seems to explain the behavior is called the correspondence bias. A good example of the correspondence bias is the tendency to infer that the personalities of actors and actresses correspond to the roles they play. Even though we know that Arnold Schwarzenegger is playing a role that calls for him to behave aggressively, we still might infer that he is a somewhat aggressive person. Importance and implications of correspondent inference theory. Correspondent inference theory helped to launch the study of how people draw inferences from behavior. We often draw inferences about other people, such as students, professors, coworkers, neighbors, salespeople, politicians, and friends, based on their behavior. The inferences we draw can affect our safety, our future friendships, whom we might date or marry, whether we choose to help someone, whether we might choose a particular college or a particular job, and many other important decisions. 7. Drive theory. Drive theory definition. Drive refers to increased arousal and internal motivation to reach a particular goal. Psychologists differentiate between primary and secondary drives. Primary drives are directly related to survival and include the need for food, water, and oxygen. Secondary or acquired drives are those that are culturally determined or learned, such as the drive to obtain money, intimacy, or social approval. Drive theory holds that these drives motivate people to reduce desires by choosing responses that will most effectively do so. For instance, when a person feels hunger, he or she is motivated to reduce that drive by eating. When there is a task at hand, the person is motivated to complete it. Drive theory background. Clark L. Hull is the most prominent figure from whom this comprehensive drive theory of learning and motivation was postulated. The theory itself was founded on very straightforward studies of rat behavior done by Hull's students, Charles T. Perm and Stanley B. Williams. The rats were trained to run down a straight alleyway to a food reward. Thereafter, two groups of rats were deprived of food, one group for 3 hours and the other for 22. Hull proposed that the rats that were without food the longest would have more motivation, thus a higher level of drive to obtain the food reward at the end of the maze. Furthermore, he hypothesized that the more times an animal was rewarded for running down the alley, the more likely the rat was to develop the habit of running. As expected, Hull and his students found that length of deprivation and number of times rewarded resulted in a faster running speed toward the reward. His conclusion was that drive and habit equally contribute to performance of whichever behavior is instrumental in drive reduction. Drive theory application to social psychology. When a person is hungry or thirsty, he or she feels tension and is motivated to reduce this state of discomfort by eating or drinking. A state of tension can also occur when a person is watched by other people or simultaneously holds psychologically inconsistent beliefs or thoughts. The theory of cognitive dissonance, proposed by social psychologist Leon Festinger, suggests that when a person is faced with two beliefs or thoughts that are contradictory, he or she feels psychological tension. This psychological tension is a negative drive state that is similar to hunger or thirst. Once a person feels cognitive dissonance, he or she is motivated to reduce this psychological tension, modifying beliefs or thoughts to match one another. An interesting application of drive theory to social psychology is found in Robert Zajance's explanation of the social facilitation effect, which suggests that when there is social presence, people tend to perform simple tasks better and complex tasks worse, social inhibition, than they would if they were alone. The basis for social facilitation comes from social psychologist Norman Triplett, who observed that bicyclists rode faster when competing against each other directly than in individual time trials. Zajance reasoned that this phenomenon is a function of humans' perceived difficulty of the task and their dominant responses, those that are most likely given the skills humans have. When drives are activated, people are likely to rely on their easily accessible dominant response, or as Hull would suggest, their habits. Therefore, if the task comes easy to them, their dominant response is to perform well. However, if the task is perceived as difficult, the dominant response will likely result in a poor performance. For instance, imagine a ballet dancer who was ill-practiced and often made several errors during her routine. According to drive theory, when in the presence of others at her recital, she will display her dominant response, which is to make mistakes even more so than when alone. However, if she spent a substantial amount of time polishing her performance, drive theory would suggest that she may have the best performance of her dancing career, which she might never match in solitude. Behavioral and social psychological perspectives, although addressing different phenomena, share an important similarity. Humans experience arousal drive to achieve a particular goal. Habits or dominant responses dictate the means for reaching that goal. With enough practice, the perceived difficulty of a task will decrease, and people are likely to perform better. How can the simple presence of other people in our environment affect our behavior? We can never be sure how others will react to us. Will they evaluate, admire, or judge us? From an evolutionary standpoint, because we do not know how people will respond to us, it is advantageous for individuals to be aroused in the presence of others. Our instinctive drive to notice and react to other social beings provides the foundation of Zayance's drive theory. For instance, imagine walking down the street late at night when you see a dark shadow approaching you. You will likely prepare yourself for this unexpected encounter. Your heart rate will increase, you might run, or you may even choose to socialize. Nonetheless, Zayance maintains that your impulse is to become socially aware of those in your proximity whose intentions are unknowable. What does another's presence make people feel? One theory suggested by social psychologist Nicholas B. Cottrell includes an evaluation apprehension model. This model suggests that humans experience arousal in the form of anxiety because of the fear of being evaluated or judged by those around them. In several experiments, it was found that the drive to present oneself as capable to avoid negative evaluation was non-existent when the audience was blindfolded, thus, they were inattentive to the task at hand. When the audience was attentive to the task, however, instinctive drive promoted better performance. Drive theory implications. Drive theory combines motivation, learning, reinforcement, and habit formation to explain and predict human behavior. It describes where drives come from, what behaviors result from these drives, and how these behaviors are sustained. Drive theory is also important in understanding habit formation as a result of learning and reinforcement. For instance, to alter bad habits, such as drug use, which can be seen as a way to reduce the drive for euphoria, an understanding of how habits are created is essential. Drive theory offers this insight. In addition, drive theory as an explanation of instinctive arousal in the presence of others is apparent in people's daily lives. Because humans do not exist in a vacuum, it is imperative that they understand how others influence them, their performance, their self-concept, and the impressions they make on the social world. 8. Dual process theories. Dual process theories. Definition. Dual process theories are a group of theories in social, personality, and cognitive psychology that describe how people think about information when they make judgments or solve problems. These theories are called dual process because they distinguish two basic ways of thinking about information: a relatively fast, superficial, spontaneous mode based on intuitive associations, and a more in-depth, effortful, step-by-step mode based on systematic reasoning. Dual process theories have been applied in many areas of psychology, including persuasion, stereotyping, person perception, memory, and negotiation. In general, these theories assume that people will think about information in a relatively superficial and spontaneous way unless they are both able and motivated to think more carefully. Dual process theories. Background and history. Dual process theories are built on several key ideas that have a long history in psychology. For instance, the two modes of thinking described by various dual process theories can often be mapped onto a top-down, idea-driven way of understanding the world versus a bottom-up, data-driven way of understanding. The notion that the way people understand the world is critically influenced by the knowledge that they bring to a situation, so that they begin at the top, their heads, in their understanding, as well as by the information provided within the situation itself. The bottom dates back to Wolfgang Kohler's distinction in the 1930s between perception and sensation. For instance, when a person looks at a book on a table, he or she senses both a pattern of colors and lines with his or her eyes and actively labels the pattern, book, by using his or her knowledge about what a book is like. Dual process theories also build on Gestalt principles explored by psychologists in the 1930s and 1940s, which suggest that people have a natural tendency to make experiences meaningful, structured, and coherent. By focusing on how one thing relates to the next and seeing patterns in the way that events unfold, a person can understand and predict the social world, which allows him or her to anticipate, plan, and act effectively. These and other elements were integrated into dual process theories in a variety of fields, beginning in the 1980s, often as an attempt to understand and synthesize conflicting findings or theories in the area. In persuasion, for instance, the development of two dual process theories, the elaboration likelihood model and the heuristic systematic model, allowed researchers to organize complex findings in the field of attitudes and attitude change and explain why certain variables sometimes lead to attitude change and sometimes do not. For instance, when people are relying on simple, intuitive shortcuts in their thinking, they will be more persuaded by an expert than by a non-expert, even when the expert's arguments are not very good. However, when people are relying more on systematic, bottom-up processing of all available information, they will tend to be more persuaded by good arguments than by someone's title. Similarly, in the field of person perception, the continuum model of impression formation was developed in an attempt to reconcile two competing viewpoints on how people perceive others, one proposing that individuals form impressions in a bottom-up fashion, adding up lots of specific evaluations about a target person to form an overall average impression, and another claiming that people form impressions based on stereotypes or other social categories, e.g., race, gender. The continuum model suggests that people can use both of these modes, and the model identifies when a perceiver will rely solely on an initial, general categorization and when he or she will go on to think more carefully about another person based on unique information about that individual. Dual process theory's importance and consequences. As dual process theories became increasingly popular, they were adopted by more and more areas of psychology to describe how people think about information and arrive at conclusions. Dual process theories differ in various ways. For instance, some assume that the two ways of thinking about information are mutually exclusive, either or, whereas others suggest that they happen one after the other, or even at the same time. However, the theories are more similar than different. They typically distinguish between a quick, superficial mode and an effortful, systematic mode of thinking. They also identify factors that affect whether people are able to and want to think carefully about information. In addition, they predict how the use of each mode will influence outcomes such as judgments, attitudes, stereotyping, and memory. By focusing on how people think about social information, dual process theories allow psychologists to identify the way in which a given variable, e.g., time pressure, will influence these thought processes and how this change in thinking will in turn affect the conclusions and judgments that people make. As an example, consider the heuristic systematic model of attitude change in the field of persuasion. Like other dual process theories, the heuristic systematic model proposes two distinct modes of thinking about information. Systematic processing involves attempts to thoroughly understand any information encountered through careful attention, deep thinking, and intensive reasoning, e.g., thinking carefully about the arguments presented, the person arguing, and the causes of the person's behavior. This information is combined and used to guide subsequent attitudes, judgments, and behaviors. For instance, a systematic approach to thinking about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict might involve reading as many magazine and newspaper reports as possible to learn and develop an opinion about the best course of action for the Middle East. Not surprisingly, such systematic thinking entails a great deal of mental effort, and requires that a person A can devote a certain amount of attention to thinking about the issue and B wants to devote this attention. Thus, systematic processing is unlikely to occur unless a person is both able and motivated to do it. Relative to systematic processing, heuristic processing is much less mentally demanding and much less dependent on having the ability, e.g., enough knowledge and enough time to think carefully about information. In fact, heuristic processing has often been called relatively automatic because it can occur even when people are not motivated and able to deliberately think about a topic. Heuristic processing involves focusing on easily noticed and easily understood cues, such as a communicator's credentials, e.g., expert or not, the group membership of the communicator, e.g., Democrat or Republican, or the number of arguments presented, many or few. These cues are linked to well-learned, everyday decision rules known as heuristics. Examples include, experts know best, my own group can be trusted, and argument length equals argument strength. These simple, intuitive rules allow people to form judgments, attitudes, and intentions quickly and efficiently, simply on the basis of the easily noticed cues, and with little critical thinking. A heuristic approach to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict might involve simply adopting the opinion of a noted Middle East political expert. In other words, heuristic thinking is what a person does when he or she does not have much ability or time to think about something and wants to make a quick decision. The heuristic systematic model suggests that people's ability and motivation to think carefully about information influence whether they rely solely on quick decision rules or go on to think about information more carefully and deeply. Furthermore, this model identifies three broad categories of motives that influence whether thinking in either manner will be relatively open-minded versus relatively biased. Accuracy motivation is geared toward discovering what is correct. Accuracy motivation leads to relatively open-minded, even-handed thinking. Defense motivation refers to the need to protect oneself against potential threats to one's valued opinions and beliefs. This self-focused motivation leads people to choose heuristics that help protect their beliefs and to systematically think about information in a biased way that supports these beliefs. Finally, impression motivation involves the desire to make a good impression on another person or to maintain a positive relationship with someone. This other focused motivation also biases thinking in favor of reaching a desired conclusion, in this case, the one that will best serve the relationship. Research on these three motivations reveals that people can think about information in an open-minded way when they have a lot of time and energy and really want to, but they are also very good at thinking about information in a way that lets them believe what they want to believe or what they think others want them to believe. Dual process theories have been applied to many other research areas in social psychology. For example, the MODE model, motivation and opportunity as determinants of the attitude-behavior relationship, suggests that attitudes may guide behaviors in one of two ways. Strong positive or negative attitudes can guide behavior directly, without the individual thinking very much. Or, individuals can construct their attitudes in a more bottom-up, systematic fashion and then use this new attitude to determine their behavior. As another example, dual process models of how we perceive other people suggest two sequential modes of thinking about information when forming impressions of others. First, individuals spontaneously categorize the person, e.g., she is a woman, he is Chinese, and then, if they are both motivated and able to do so, they continue on to think more systematically about individuating, unique features of the person. Similarly, a dual-process model of stereotyping suggests that people have an automatic tendency to stereotype others but can correct this stereotype if they are motivated and able to deliberately modify their views. Perhaps most recently, a dual-process perspective has been applied to negotiation settings. Studies in this field suggest that when negotiators have little desire to think carefully or are unable to think carefully, they often rely on stereotypes about an opponent's group membership or the belief that if one side wins the negotiation, the other has to lose. In contrast, when motivation and ability to think carefully are relatively high, reliance on these heuristics tends to decrease, and systematic processing increases. This allows negotiators to discover win-win solutions that are better for both parties. 9. Dynamic systems theory. Dynamical systems theory definition. Emotions go up and down over the course of days. But sometimes emotions are more constant. For instance, depression could be characterized with fairly constant negative emotions across days. When will hearing some negative information lead a person into a depressed pattern? When will the same negative information just lead to a bad day among the good days? Dynamical systems theory, also known as dynamic systems theory or just systems theory, is a series of principles and tools for studying change. It is based on concepts from mathematics and is a general approach applicable to almost any phenomenon. There are two types of change that are central to this method. First, a systems approach focuses on how a phenomenon changes over time. For example, a systems approach to emotions concentrates on how emotions evolve in time rather than whether a person is happy or sad on a given day. It seeks to identify patterns of change that can be reoccurring, constant, or even ever-changing. For example, emotions might go back and forth between good and bad days, reoccurring, remain negative, constant, not unlike depression, or constantly change in complex ways. A systems approach often assesses the stability of those patterns. For example, will receiving some negative information knock a person out of a pattern of ups and downs? Will the same negative information disrupt a constant negative pattern such as depression? Dynamical systems theory can also identify when the pattern of emotional change will evolve into another pattern on its own or in relation to other parts of the system. For example, under what circumstances can only a constant negative pattern of emotions exist? In summary, dynamic systems can be used to identify what might alter the entire long-term pattern of emotions that follow. The second type of change examined by systems theory is that which occurs from the many interactions among units, i.e., individuals, groups, aspects within the individual. For example, a systems perspective of emotions might simultaneously consider the interaction of the differing emotions between a husband and wife. These interactions are assumed to be multidirectional. That is, the husband and wife mutually influence one another so that each changes and limits the emotions of the other. Because of these mutual influences on emotions with other people, there is the potential for each person to generate a very complicated pattern of emotions in time. Surprisingly, these multi-component systems tend to generate relatively simple patterns. For example, a pair of individuals who begin with different emotions might converge on the same emotional pattern and might even help each other maintain that pattern stability. That is, a couple both in the same ups and downs of emotions might make each person in the pair more resistant to negative information. This order emerges because of the multidirectional and reciprocal influences and tends to promote a great deal of predictive power. For example, you might need to know only the emotional pattern of a single individual in a group to know automatically the emotional changes of every other individual in the group. Thus, part of a systems perspective is identifying the qualities that depict the entire multi-component system. Context and importance of dynamical systems theory within social psychology. Systems theory has been applied to a wide variety of topics. It is often called a meta-theoretical perspective because its principles can be applied to virtually any phenomenon. For this reason, systems theory is often thought not to be theory at all but instead a descriptive tool. Regardless, systems theory is inherently an interdisciplinary approach found in fields as diverse as mathematics, physics, architecture, biology, chemistry, and psychology, sharing the same language, tools, and concepts. Dynamical systems theory applications. Systems theory tends to be applied in three main ways. The first, dynamical systems modeling, consists of generating simulations of the many interactions functioning over time. The simulations describe the phenomenon mathematically, testing out situations that parallel the real world but that would be difficult to study in the real world. For example, it is possible to study the emotions of couples across days, but modeling could be used to examine emotions at a community level, identifying the circumstances that discriminate when depression is commonplace in a community from when it is rare. Dynamical systems models have revealed that very simple mathematical equations of change are capable of producing a great deal of complexity. The simulations need not be very complicated to move beyond predicting patterns in real life. However, both relatively simple equations and very complex ones can also generate order. The second way dynamic systems theory is used is empirically. In empirical methods, mathematical concepts are applied through longitudinal methods and designs that measure changes over time. These studies tend to be very data demanding, often collecting information in real time over long periods of time. Mathematical equations and systems concepts are then used to describe the outcomes, often generating new predictions for further empirical studies. Lastly, systems theory is used as a metaphor whereby the concepts are applied qualitatively without use of mathematical relationships. Many phenomena in psychology cannot easily be measured at the quantitative level that is demanded by empirical systems techniques. Nor can they be easily quantifiable by a set of equations. Thus, the concepts are used as heuristic examples of the phenomenon. Since a systems approach focuses on change and complex interactions, the concepts are still metaphorically informative to the psychological sciences. 10. Equity theory. Equity theory definition. Equity theory posits that when it comes to relationships, two concerns stand out. 1. How rewarding are their societal, family, and work relationships? 2. How fair and equitable are those relationships? According to equity theory, people feel most comfortable when they are getting exactly what they deserve from their relationships, no more and certainly no less. Equity theory consists of 4 propositions. Proposition I: men and women are wired up to try to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. Proposition 2: society, however, has a vested interest in persuading people to behave fairly and equitably. Groups will generally reward members who treat others equitably and punish those who treat others inequitably. Proposition 3: given societal pressures, people are most comfortable when they perceive that they are getting roughly what they deserve from life and love. If people feel overbenefited, they may experience pity, guilt, and shame. If underbenefited, they may experience anger, sadness, and resentment. Proposition IV: people in inequitable relationships will attempt to reduce their distress via a variety of techniques, by restoring psychological equity, actual equity, or leaving the relationship. Context and importance of equity theory. People everywhere are concerned with justice. What's fair is fair. She deserves better. It's just not right. He can't get away with that, it's illegal. It's unethical. It's immoral. Yet, historically, societies have had very different visions as to what constitutes social justice and fairness. Some dominant views include the following: all men are created equal. The more you invest in a project, the more profit you deserve to reap. American capitalism. Each according to his need. Communism. Winner take all. Dog eat dog. Capitalism. Nonetheless, in all societies, fairness and justice are deemed important. This entry will consider the consequences for men and women when they feel fairly or unfairly treated. Although equity has been found to be important in a wide variety of relationships, societal relationships, romantic and family relationships, helping relationships, exploitative relationships, and work relationships, this entry will focus on the research in one area: romantic and marital relationships. Measuring equity. Although technically equity is defined by a complex formula, in practice, in love relationships, equity has been assessed by a simple measure: considering what you put into your dating relationship, marriage, compared to what you get out of it, and what your partner puts in compared to what he or she gets out of it. How does your dating relationship, marriage, stack up? +3, I am getting a much better deal than my partner. +2, I am getting a somewhat better deal. +1, I am getting a slightly better deal. 0, we are both getting an equally good, or bad, deal. -1, my partner is getting a slightly better deal. -2, my partner is getting a somewhat better deal. -3, my partner is getting a much better deal than I am. On the basis of their answers, persons can be classified as overbenefited, receiving more than they deserve, equitably treated, or underbenefited, receiving less than they deserve. Equity in love relationships. The research. There is considerable evidence that in love relationships, equity matters. Specifically, researchers find that the more socially desirable people are, the more attractive, personable, famous, rich, or considerate they are, the more socially desirable they will expect a mate to be. Also, dating couples are more likely to fall in love if they perceive their relationships to be equitable. Couples are likely to end up with someone fairly close to themselves in social desirability. They are also likely to be matched on the basis of self-esteem, looks, intelligence, education, mental and physical health, or disability. In addition, couples who perceive their relationships to be equitable are more likely to get involved sexually. For example, couples were asked how intimate their relationships were, whether they involved necking, petting, genital play, intercourse, cunnilingus, or fellatio. Couples in equitable relationships generally were having sexual relations. Couples in inequitable relationships tended to stop before going all the way. Couples were also asked why they'd made love. Those in equitable affairs were most likely to say that both of them wanted to have sex. Couples in inequitable relationships were less likely to claim that sex had been a mutual decision. Dating and married couples in equitable relationships also had more satisfying sexual lives than their peers. Equitable relationships are comfortable relationships. Researchers have interviewed dating couples, newlyweds, couples married for various lengths of time, including couples married 50+ years. Equitable relationships were found to be happier, most contented, and most comfortable at all ages and all stages of a relationship. Equitable relationships are also stable relationships. Couples who feel equitably treated are most confident that they will still be together in 1 year, 5 years, and 10 years. In equitable relationships, partners are generally motivated to be faithful. The more cheated men and women feel in their marriages, the more likely they are to risk engaging in fleeting extramarital love affairs. Thus, people care about how rewarding their relationships are and how fair and equitable they seem to be. Equity theory implications. Cross-cultural and historical researchers have long been interested in the impact of culture on perceptions of social justice. They contend that culture exerts a profound impact on how concerned men and women are with fairness and equity and on how fairness is defined, especially in the realm of gender relationships. Cultural and historical perspectives suggest several questions for researchers interested in social justice. What aspects of justice, love, sex, and intimacy are universal? Which are social constructions? In the wake of globalization, is the world becoming one and homogeneous, or are traditional cultural practices more tenacious and impervious to deep transformation than some have supposed? Theorists are also engaged in a debate as to whether certain visions of social justice, especially in romantic and marital relationships, are better than others. Some cultural theorists argue that all visions are relative and that social psychologists must avoid cultural arrogance and ethnocentrism and strive to respect cultural variety. Others insist that universal human rights do exist and that certain practices are abhorrent, whatever their cultural sources. These include genocide, ethnic cleansing, torture, and in the area of gender and family relationships, the sale of brides, the forcing of girls into prostitution, dowry murders, sati or widow burning, genital mutilation, infanticide, and discriminatory laws against women's civic, social, and legal equality, just to name just a few. In this world, in which the yearning for modernity and globalization contend with yearnings for cultural traditions, this debate over what is meant by equity and social justice is likely to continue and to be a lively one. 11. Error management theory. Error management theory definition. One of the great challenges for humans is figuring out what is going on in other people's minds. People don't always disclose exactly what they are thinking, they can behave in very ambiguous ways, and sometimes they can be downright deceptive. For example, when a woman smiles at a man, is she sexually interested in him or just being nice? Sometimes the errors people make in judging others are systematic, meaning that they tend to be biased in one direction or another. For example, judgments might be systematically biased toward a false positive error or a false negative error. In judging others, you would make a false positive error if you believed that a person had a particular thought or intention when the person actually did not. If you judged that the woman was sexually interested in the man, for instance, when she actually was not, you would make a false positive error. On the other hand, you would make a false negative error if you believed that a person did not have a particular thought or intention when the person actually did. If you judged that the woman was not sexually interested in the man when she actually was, you would make a false negative error. Error management theory proposes that the direction of a bias in social judgment is tied to how costly different kinds of errors are. For example, consider how smoke alarms are designed. Failures to detect fires, false negative errors, are extremely costly, whereas false alarms, false positives, are usually just inconvenient. So, when engineers make smoke alarms, they tend to design them to be biased away from the more costly false negative error by setting a low threshold for fire detection. As a consequence, smoke alarms will tend to be systematically biased toward false positive errors, false alarms. A low threshold for fire detection will cause smoke alarms to make more errors overall, but it will minimize the cost of errors when they inevitably occur, i.e., the errors will tend to be false alarms rather than missed fires. Error management theory proposes that the same principle of design applies to the evolution of judgment mechanisms in the human mind. Ancestrally, in many areas of social judgment, the costs of false positive and false negative errors differed. When the costs of false negatives are greater, error management theory predicts a bias toward false positives, as in the smoke alarm example. When the costs of false positives are greater, error management theory predicts a bias toward false negatives. Error management theory examples and evidence. One example of a false positive bias is in men's estimations of women's sexual interest. For an ancestral man, failing to detect sexual interest in a woman resulted in a missed reproductive opportunity, which was highly costly to his reproductive success. The opposite error, believing that a woman was interested when she was not, was perhaps a bit embarrassing but probably less costly overall. Thus, error management theory predicts that natural selection designed a bias in men toward slightly overestimating a woman's sexual interest to reduce the likelihood of a missed sexual opportunity. This leads modern men to overperceive women's sexual interest. The same prediction does not apply to women's perceptions because women need to invest very heavily in each offspring and because reproductive opportunities tend to be easier for women to acquire. Evidence of this bias has been gathered in many types of studies. In laboratory studies of interactions between male and female strangers, men viewing the interaction tend to infer greater flirtatiousness in the female than do women viewing the interaction. In surveys of people's past experiences, women report more cases in which men overestimated their sexual interest than in which men underestimated it, whereas men's reports of women's over- and underestimation errors do not differ. When men and women are shown romantic movies, men's subsequent tendency to see sexual interest in photographs of neutral female faces is greater than women's. An example of a false negative bias is in women's judgments of men's interest in commitment during courtship. Women must invest heavily in each offspring produced, and therefore they tend to be very careful in choosing mates and in consenting to sex. One feature women prefer in mates is investment, a man's ability and willingness to invest time and resources in caring for a woman and her offspring. However, women must predict a man's tendency to invest from his behaviors, and therefore their judgments will be susceptible to some degree of error. Here again, there is an asymmetry in the costs of the errors in the judgment task. Judging that a man will commit and invest when he actually will not, a false positive error, could result in the woman consenting to sex and being subsequently abandoned. In harsh ancestral environments, this literally could have been deadly to the woman's offspring. The opposite error, believing that the man is not committed when he actually is, a false negative, would typically result only in a delay of reproduction for the woman, which would tend to be less costly. Error management theory therefore predicts that women will tend to be skeptical of men's commitment, especially during the early phases of courtship. This prediction has been tested by comparing men's and women's impressions of male courtship behaviors. Relative to men, women express skepticism about a variety of male courtship tactics, including buying flowers, cooking a gourmet dinner, and saying, "I love you." These two examples concern judgments in courtship, but the odds that the costs of the two error types are identical for any particular area of judgment are essentially zero, and therefore error management theory applies to a broad array of judgment tasks. Other biases that may be explained by error management theory include the following: the tendency for people to overestimate the dangerousness of unfamiliar others, the tendency for people to infer that they will be caught if they attempt to cheat in certain types of social interactions, even when they know that their identity is concealed from others, the tendency for people to avoid close contact with non-contagious sick, injured, or unfamiliar others who actually pose little risk, the tendency for people to have certain positive illusions that cause them to strive to attain goals that are in fact very difficult to attain, but if they are attained lead to substantial benefits. Implications and importance of error management theory. Psychologists often debate whether humans are rational or irrational. Those arguing that humans are irrational cite evidence of bias and errors in human judgment. Error management theory suggests that judgment strategies biased toward less costly errors are expected to evolve and are actually superior to unbiased strategies. Therefore, mere evidence of bias is not necessarily evidence of irrationality or poor judgment, as is often claimed. There are practical implications of understanding error management biases. The Safeway supermarket chain made news in the 1990s because of their service with a smile policy, which required all employees to smile and make eye contact with customers. The female employees in the chain filed complaints about this policy because they found that men tended to misinterpret their friendliness as sexual interest, leading to instances of sexual harassment. Knowledge of error management biases and the cues that trigger them may help to create better social policies. 12. Escape theory. Escape theory definition. Escape theory refers to the tendency for people to engage in behaviors to avoid an unpleasant psychological reaction. Whereas the common use of the term escape suggests physically removing oneself from a physical location, such as escaping from prison, escape theory is used to describe behaviors that enable a person to flee from negative perceptions of the self. Escape from the self may help a person temporarily avoid a negative psychological reaction, but the behaviors that follow from a motivation to escape from the self are frequently undesirable. Escape theory. History and background. Social psychology has a long history of examining the consequences of how people view themselves for their behavior. People construct and interpret meaning based on how well their identity falls short of, meets, or exceeds expectations that people set for themselves or that are supported by social norms. Escape theory is concerned primarily with the behaviors that follow when people recognize that some part of their identity falls short of desired standards. When people realize that a part of their identity fails to meet desired standards, they narrow the focus of their attention to the present and immediate environment to avoid meaningful thought regarding unflattering aspects of themselves. Over the past several decades, social psychologists have demonstrated that people construct and interpret meaning at both high and low levels. High levels of meaning involve comparison of oneself against broad personal or social standards, such as how a current behavior might relate to an event that might occur in the future. Low levels of meaning, in contrast, involve a narrow, concrete awareness of the immediate present. Studying for an exam, for example, can be explained as fulfilling a long-term goal of achieving academic and career success, high level of meaning. At a low level of meaning, studying for an exam could be explained as simple eye and muscle movements. Charles Carver and Michael Shire proposed that people shift their level of awareness to a low level of meaning when they are confronted with parts of their identity that fail to meet socially approved standards. Other research has shown that people prefer a low level of awareness after experiencing failure or stress. Thus, past theory and research have shown that people seek to escape from the self when one or more aspects of their identity fall short of expectations. 6 main steps in escape theory. Escape theory is organized in 6 main steps. First, the person has a severe experience in which he or she realizes that current outcomes or circumstances fall below societal or self-imposed standards. Second, the person blames these disappointing outcomes on internal aspects of the self, i.e., parts of his or her personality, as opposed to situational factors. Third, the person recognizes that current outcomes portray the self as inadequate, incompetent, unattractive, or guilty. Fourth, the person experiences negative emotions as a result of the realization that current outcomes fall short of desired expectations. Fifth, the person seeks to escape from this negative psychological reaction by avoiding high-level, meaningful thought. Sixth, the consequences of this avoidance of meaningful thought results in a lack of restraint, which may give rise to undesirable behaviors. The steps in escape theory signify points in a causal process that are dependent on each other. The causal process will lead to undesirable behaviors only if the person proceeds through each of the previous 5 steps. If the person explains a recent failure as caused by situational factors as opposed to blaming it on deficient aspects of the self, then the process will not lead to undesirable behaviors. Escape from the self should therefore be considered a relatively uncommon response to distressing or disappointing outcomes or circumstances. Applying escape theory to behavioral outcomes. Escape theory has been applied to several behavioral outcomes. Nearly all of these behaviors produce immediate relief but also involve long-term negative consequences. Suicide attempts can be considered as attempts to escape from the self. Roy Baumeister showed that many suicide attempts are the result of a shift to a low level of meaning, i.e., focus on immediate environment to avoid the negative emotions that result from not achieving a desired goal. Escape theory has also been applied to sexual masochism, or the tendency to derive sexual satisfaction from being physically or emotionally abused. people who engage in sexually masochistic behaviors often do so out of a motivation to narrow their attention to immediate, intense sensations, thereby making the likelihood of maintaining a normal sense of identity impossible. Alcohol use may also serve the function of allowing people to escape from negative thoughts about oneself by reducing the ability for people to process complex information in a high-level, meaningful manner. Instead, alcohol use typically renders people incapable of considering how their current outcomes compare to societal and self-imposed standards for desirable behavior. Other research has suggested that cigarette smoking may be understood as goal-directed behavior aimed at achieving a low level of distraction from negative thoughts about oneself. Todd Heatherton and Baumeister have applied escape theory to binge eating. First, a person may realize that he or she is not meeting a self-imposed weight loss goal. Second, a person may explain his or her failure to lose weight as the result of being an incompetent person instead of focusing on how factors in the environment prevented him or her from losing weight. Third, the person may become intensely aware that his or her failure to lose weight reflects negatively on his or her identity of being a competent and attractive person. Fourth, the person experiences negative emotions after realizing that his or her current body weight does not meet his or her desired body weight. Fifth, the person shifts his or her level of awareness to a low level, i.e., focuses on sensations and objects in the current environment to escape the negative psychological reaction that resulted from realizing that he or she did not meet a desired weight loss goal. Sixth, the focus on the immediate aspects of the current environment reduces the tendency for the person to consider the long-term consequences of his or her behavior. This lack of restraint increases the tendency for people to engage in typically undesirable behaviors, such as binge eating. 13. Excitation transfer theory. Ever heard of overreacting? Such as when lovers, after yelling their heads off arguing, make up and experience unusually strong sexual pleasures. Or when a disagreement escalates from silly to serious, prompts an exchange of insults, and ends with bloody noses. Or when the girl who went along to a horror movie is so terrified that she snuggles up on her companion and finds him irresistibly attractive. It seems that even the most rational people are not immune to such overreacting. The famous philosopher and mathematician Bertrand Russell, for instance, let the world know that his sexual experience was never more intense than during extreme fear, when his bedroom was lit up by exploding grenades during the Nazis' bombardment of London. There is ample research evidence that supports this unlikely enhancement of pleasure by fear. Samuel Klausner observed, for example, that newcomers to parachuting tend to experience considerable fear before jumping but also intense joy upon landing. As jumping becomes routine and fear diminishes, joy fades away along with the fear. The facilitation of pleasure in the aftermath of fear and similarly unpleasant reactions is by no means the only transition in which an earlier emotion intensifies a following one. The intensification occurs, no matter whether the prior and the subsequent emotions are pleasant or unpleasant. For instance, prior elation can enhance ensuing distress as readily as prior grief ensuing merriment. Likewise, prior anger can enhance ensuing rage as readily as prior gaiety ensuing exuberance. Dolph Zillman proposed a theory of excitation transfer to explain this puzzling intensification of emotions that materialize in the aftermath of other emotional experiences. Excitation as the driving force in emotion. Excitation transfer theory focuses on physiological manifestations of bodily arousal. All vital emotions are known to be accompanied by elevated sympathetic reactivity in the autonomic nervous system. According to the emergency theory of emotion advanced by Walter Cannon, the primary function of this reactivity is to provide energy for a burst of action to allow the organism to cope effectively with acute behavioral challenges. As coping via immediate physical action is rarely productive in contemporary situations of challenge, much of this energy provision has become defunct, if not dysfunctional. Such energizing excitatory reactivity has been retained nonetheless, mostly because of its mediation by archaic brain structures, as detailed by Joseph Ledoux and others. This reactivity still generates agitation that favors action over inaction. Via feedback, such as heart pounding, palm sweating, or trembling hands, it fosters cognizance of the degree of bodily arousal. It ultimately signals emotional intensity and thus drives the experience and expression of emotions. cognitive and excitatory adjustment to environmental change. The time course of cognitive and excitatory reactions to emotion-arousing changes in the environment differs greatly. Cognitive adjustment to such changes is quasi-instantaneous because of the exceedingly fast neural mediation of cognition. In contrast, the hormonal mediation of sympathetic excitation via the cardiovascular system is lethargic, and excitatory adjustment to situational changes comes about only after considerable passage of time. The latency of excitatory responding may be negligible, but the duration of excitatory reactivity is not. Once instigated, this activity runs its course even after the instigating emotional challenge has ceased to exist and, owing to rapid cognitive adjustment, another emotion has come about. Emotion intensification by leftover excitation. Excitation transfer theory is based on the apparent discrepancy in adjustment time. It addresses the consequences of persisting sympathetic excitation from an earlier instigated emotion for subsequently instigated emotions that may be different in kind. Specifically, the theory predicts that whenever particular circumstances evoke an emotional reaction at a time when portions of excitation are left over from preceding emotions, the leftover portions combine inseparably with newly instigated excitation and thus produce a total of excitatory activity whose intensity is greater than that specific to the new instigation alone. Leftover excitation may thus be considered to have artificially intensified the newly triggered emotion. In other words, the response to the new situation amounts to an overreaction. An illustration of excitation transfer: imagine a lady who steps on a snake in the grass of her backyard. Deep-rooted survival mechanisms, organized in the brain's limbic system, will be activated and make her jump back and scream. A rush of adrenaline will have been released to elevate sympathetic excitation. Following these initial reactions, the woman is bound to construe her emotional behavior as fear and panic. She might also notice herself shaking and thus realize that she is greatly excited. However, upon looking once more at the object of her terror, she recognizes that the snake is a rubber dummy, planted by her mischievous son, who enters the scene laughing his head off. This recognition, a result of instant cognitive adjustment to changing circumstances, proves her initial emotion of fear groundless and calls for a new interpretation of her experiential state. Still shaking from the scare, she is likely to feel acute anger toward her son. In her infuriation, she might even lash out at him. But after fully comprehending the prank, she might consider being angry inappropriate and cognitively adjust once more, this time joining in his laughter and appraising her experience as amusement. Throughout this cognitive switching from experiential state to state, the excitatory reaction to the detected danger in the grass persisted to varying degrees. It initially determined the intensity of the fear reaction. The leftover excitation from this reaction then intensified the emotion of volatile anger and, thereafter, the experience of amusement in fits of hysterical laughter. In short, leftover excitation fostered overreactions in a string of different emotions. Supportive evidence emotion-enhancing excitation transfer has been demonstrated in numerous experiments. Dolph Zillman and his collaborators have shown, for instance, that sympathetic excitation left over from sexual excitement can intensify such diverse emotions as anger, aggression, sadness, humor, and altruism. In the reverse direction, sympathetic excitation left over from either fear or anger proved capable of enhancing sexual attraction and sexual behaviors. In the realm of entertainment, moreover, excitation transfer theory has been used to explain the facilitation of enjoyment in the aftermath of evoked aversions. Based on the observation that leftover excitation from feelings of tension, suspense, and terror is capable of intensifying experiences of joy and elation, strategies could be devised for the ultimate enjoyment of drama by the optimal arrangement of foregoing emotion-evoking events. 14. Implicit personality theory. Implicit personality theory definition. An implicit personality theory refers to a person's notions about which personality characteristics tend to co-occur in people. Can one assume, for example, that a person with a sense of humor is also intelligent? Is a charming person likely to be honest or dishonest? Is a leader someone likely to be friendly or aggressive? Implicit personality theories guide the inferences that social perceivers make of other people. For example, if a perceiver sees someone act in an energetic style and presumes that energy is linked to intelligence, then the perceiver will likely infer that the other person is intelligent. History and background of implicit personality theory. The notion of implicit personality theories was introduced into modern psychology by Lee Cronbach in the 1950s, with his notion of the generalized other. This other, cf. Fontaine, the person's beliefs about the attributes and abilities that the typical person exhibited, along with how those attributes and abilities interrelated. Importantly, Cronbach believed that people's theories about attributes and abilities align those qualities into a few major dimensions of personality, and subsequent work by numerous researchers set out to discover what those dimensions were. Different researchers came to different conclusions about what the major dimensions of personality were, but some dimensions frequently uncovered were good versus bad traits, socially skilled versus unskilled, intellectually gifted versus not, active versus passive, friendly versus unfriendly, dominant versus submissive, and accepting versus rejecting of authority. One major controversy regarding implicit personality theories is whether they reflect reality or distort it. For example, when people associate leadership with a dominant personality, are they merely reflecting the social world as it truly exists, or are they making an assumption not supported by real-world evidence, and perhaps only reflecting the fact that leadership and dominance are words that overlap in their dictionary meaning? Although any conclusion would still be contentious, one way to read the research is that implicit personality theories mirror reality somewhat but overstate it. Many people overestimate how related some traits really are in people, although those traits, in truth, are somewhat related. It should be noted that the term implicit personality theory more recently has been used to denote another way in which theories about personality attributes may differ. According to the work by Carol Dweck, people differ according to whether they believe personal attributes, such as intelligence, can be modified or enhanced through effort versus remaining stable and immutable regardless of what the person does. This use of the term implicit personality theory is completely separate from the one defined in this entry. Implications of implicit personality theory. Implicit personality theories carry many implications for social judgment. They have been shown, for example, to influence performance evaluations in organizations. If an employee shows one trait, a person evaluating them assumes that they have other traits as well. Such theories have also been shown to influence memory for other people, in that social perceivers tend to remember traits and behaviors heavily suggested by their implicit personality theories that were actually not present. Two specific types of implicit personality theories have received special attention in psychological research. First, the halo effect refers to the tendency to conclude that a person has a number of positive attributes if they display a few good ones, and to infer a number of negative traits if the person exhibits an undesirable one. Second, physical attractiveness tends to lead people to infer that an individual has a number of desirable traits. Physically attractive people are assumed to be warmer, more socially skilled, and even more intelligent, for example, than their peers. One notable example of the implications of implicit personality theories centers on HIV/AIDS prevention. People assume they can tell who is HIV positive just by looking at them, and seeing, for example, whether the person is well dressed. There is no evidence of a link between attire and health status, and so using such an implicit personality theory in this realm is, at best, worrisome. 15. Inoculation theory. Inoculation theory definition. Inoculation theory was devised by William McGuire in the early 1960s as a strategy to protect attitudes from change, to confer resistance to counterattitudinal influences, whether such influences take the form of direct attacks or sustained pressures. Nature of inoculation theory. Inoculation theory consists of two elements, threat and refutational preemption. The threat component of an inoculation treatment raises the possibility that a person may encounter persuasive challenges to existing attitudes. It is designed to get people to acknowledge the vulnerability of existing attitudes to potential change. Threat functions as the motivational catalyst to resistance. Once a person accepts that attitudes are vulnerable to change, they will expend the effort to strengthen attitudes. The refutational preemption component of an inoculation treatment raises, and then refutes, specific arguments contrary to attitudes. It is designed to provide the specific content that people can use to defend attitudes and to provide people with a model or script for how to defend attitudes. Studies by McGuire in the 1960s proved, convincingly, that inoculation works. Subsequent studies by Michael Pfau indicated that inoculation works, in part, through the theorized mechanisms of threat and counterarguing, but also by eliciting anger, making attitudes more certain, rendering attitudes more accessible, and altering the structure of associative networks. Evidence of threat's motivational role in resistance is found in the consistency of findings by McGuire and Pfau that inoculation same and inoculation different treatments are equally effective in conferring resistance to attacks. Refutational same inoculation treatments cover the same counterarguments raised in later attacks, whereas different treatments employ counterarguments that are completely different than those raised in subsequent attacks. Because inoculation different treatments feature unique content, effectiveness cannot be attributed to the refutational preemption component of the treatment. Instead, it can only be explained by the threat component, which motivates people to bolster their attitudes. The power of inoculation stems from the fact that treatments spread a broad umbrella of protection, not just against specific counterarguments raised in subsequent treatments but against all potential counterarguments. Applications of inoculation theory. Inoculation is an interesting and useful theory. Research during the past 20 years has revealed numerous real-world applications of inoculation theory. For example, studies indicate that it is possible to inoculate, for example, political supporters of a candidate in a campaign against the influence of an opponent's attack ads, citizens against the corrosive influence of soft money-sponsored political attack ads on democratic values, citizens of fledgling democracies against the spiral of silence which can thwart the expression of minority views, commercial brands against the influence of competitors' comparative ads, corporations against the damage to credibility and image that can occur in crisis settings, and young adolescents against influences of peer pressure, which can lead to smoking, underage drinking, and other harmful behaviors. 16. Interdependence theory. Interdependence theory definition. Interdependence theory describes the structural properties that characterize interactions and the implications of such structure for human psychology. Whereas most psychological theories focus on the individual, suggesting that people behave as they do because of their unique experiences or cognitions or personalities, interdependence theory regards the relationships between people as important as the people themselves. Thus, the theory represents a much-needed model of the nature and implications of interdependence. It is a truly social psychological theory. Background and history of interdependence theory. Harold Kelly and John Thibault developed interdependence theory over the course of 4 decades, beginning in the 1950s. Its initial formulation was contemporaneous with early social exchange and game theories, with which it shares some postulates. The theory analyzes interdependent structure, identifying crucial properties of interactions and relationships, as well as interdependence processes, explaining how structure influences motivation and behavior. Interdependent structure. Interdependence theory presents a formal analysis of the abstract properties of social situations. Rather than examining concrete social elements such as, professor teaches student, or, man seduces woman, the theory identifies abstract elements such as, dependence as mutual, or, partners' interests conflict. Why emphasize abstract properties? Although two situations may differ in concrete ways, they may share abstract properties that cause people to think, feel, and behave in predictable ways. The basic unit of experience is an interaction. Each of 2 or more people can enact any of 2 or more behaviors. As a result, each person experiences good versus poor outcomes, consequences that are more versus less satisfying or pleasurable. All social situations can be described in terms of 6 structural dimensions. Given that most situations are defined by their properties with respect to 2 or more structural properties, these dimensions are the building blocks of interdependent structure. Level of dependence describes the degree to which an individual's outcomes are influenced by another's actions. John is more dependent on Mary to the extent that through her actions, Mary can cause John to experience good versus poor outcomes. He is independent when her actions do not influence his well-being. Thus, John's dependence on Mary is the converse of her power over him. When John is more dependent, Mary is more powerful. Mutuality of dependence describes the degree to which people are equally dependent. Mutual dependence exists when Mary is as dependent on John as he is on her. Unilateral dependence involves vulnerability on the part of one person, in that the less dependent person may behave as he or she wishes without concern for the other's well-being. Mutuality constitutes balance of power, yielding fewer opportunities for exploitation and more congenial interaction. Basis of dependence describes whether dependence rests on partner control, where John's outcomes are governed by Mary's unilateral actions, versus joint control, where John's outcomes are governed by John's and Mary's joint actions. Partner control is absolute and externally controlled, in that John's outcomes are entirely governed by Mary's behavior. Joint control is contingent, in that John's outcomes rest on coordination with Mary, e.g., if he can predict her actions, he can modify his behavior and achieve good outcomes. Covariation of interests describes the degree to which partners' outcomes correspond, whether events that benefit John are similarly beneficial for Mary. Covariation ranges from correspondent situations, what is good for John is good for Mary, through mixed motive situations to situations with conflicting interests, zero-sum situations, i.e., what is good for John is bad for Mary. Interaction is simple when interests correspond. John can simply pursue his interests, knowing that this will also yield good outcomes for Mary. And interaction is simple when interests conflict. One person must lose if the other is to gain, so each person simply tries to win. Mixed motive situations are more complex, in that they involve a blend of cooperative and competitive motives, combining desire to benefit the other with temptation to exploit. Temporal structure describes the fact that interactions are dynamic and evolve over time. Interaction must be understood not only in terms of the immediate outcomes produced by partners' choices, but also in terms of the future behaviors and outcomes that are made available or eliminated as a result of interaction. For example, John and Mary may make an extended series of investments to develop a committed relationship. Or by behaving in a particular manner today, they may create desirable future opportunities for themselves or proceed down a path where only poor outcomes are available. Availability of information is the sixth structural dimension. John and Mary may possess adequate versus inadequate information about their own or the other's outcomes for various combinations of behavior. How does Mary feel about marriage? A partner's motives. Will Mary use her power benevolently? Or future interaction possibilities. If we do this today, where will it take us? Inadequate information gives rise to ambiguity and misunderstanding, challenging the flow of interaction. Interdependence processes affordance describes what a situation makes possible or may activate in interaction partners. Specific situations present people with specific problems and opportunities and therefore logically imply the relevance of specific motives and permit the expression of those motives. For example, situations with conflicting interests afford the expression of self-centeredness versus concern with another's well-being. John can behave in such a manner as to yield good outcomes for him or for Mary, but not for both. Therefore, conflicting interests inspire predictable sorts of cognition, greed, fear, and invite predictable forms of attribution and self-presentation. Does Mary care about me? Trust me. People do not always react to situations in ways that maximize their immediate outcomes. Transformation is the psychological process whereby people set aside their immediate, gut-level desires and instead react to a situation on the basis of broader considerations, including the well-being of others, long-term goals, or stable personal values. The transformation process may rest on systematic thought or automatic habits. It is through the transformation process that people reveal their social selves, motives deriving from the fact that people sometimes have a past and a future with interaction partners. Through attribution processes, people attempt to uncover the implications of another's actions. For example, Mary may try to discern whether John's behavior is attributable to the situation, desire for good immediate outcomes, or to John's transformation of the situation, intent to sacrifice his interests so as to give her good outcomes. In like manner, through self-presentation, people attempt to communicate the implications of their own actions. For example, John may try to communicate that in a given situation it is in his interest to behave selfishly, yet he has sacrificed so as to benefit Mary. People cannot communicate or discern all motives in all situations, in that specific motives are relevant to specific types of situations. For example, in situations with perfectly corresponding interests, John cannot display trustworthiness. If he behaves in ways that benefit Mary, he is likewise benefited, such that it is impossible to determine whether he is driven by self-interest or prosocial motives. Where do the motives that guide the transformation process come from? People initially react to situations as unique problems. In a novel situation, John may carefully analyze circumstances or react impulsively. Either way, he acquires experience. If his reaction yields poor outcomes, he will behave differently in future situations with parallel structure. If his reaction yields good outcomes, he will react similarly in future, parallel situations. Repeated experience in situations with similar structure gives rise to stable transformation tendencies that on average yield good outcomes. Stable adaptations may reside within persons, relationships, or groups. Interpersonal dispositions are actor-specific inclinations to respond to specific situations in a specific manner across numerous partners. Over the course of development, different people undergo different experiences with family members and confront different opportunities with peers. As a result, people acquire dispositions to perceive situations in specific ways, to anticipate specific motives from others, and to transform situations in predictable ways. For example, a child who encounters unresponsive caregiving may develop fearful expectations about dependence and therefore avoid situations in which she must rely on others. Thus, the interpersonal self is the sum of one's adaptations to previous interdependence problems. Relationship-specific motives are inclinations to respond to specific situations in a specific manner with a specific partner. For example, trust reflects an individual's confidence in a partner's benevolence. Mary develops trust when John behaves prosocially by departing from his immediate interests to enhance her outcomes. His actions communicate responsiveness to her needs, thereby promoting Mary's trust in his motives, increasing her comfort with dependence, strengthening her commitment, and enhancing the odds of reciprocal benevolence. Social norms are rule-based, socially transmitted inclinations to respond to particular situations in a specific manner. For example, societies develop rules regarding the expression of anger. Such rules help groups avoid the chaos that would ensue if people were to freely express hostility. Likewise, rules of etiquette represent efficient solutions to interdependence dilemmas, regulating behavior in such a manner as to yield harmonious interaction. Sometimes behavior is influenced by societal-level norms. Dyads may also develop relationship-specific norms.